Only a fighter knows what goes through the mind before a fight. The preparations, the rituals to mask the fear. Fear of these last moments of uncertainty before it's time to face the crowd. It's 1810 in the heart of London, in Georgian England, and the fight is on. Now, new research is shedding light on the seedy underbelly of the largest and most prosperous city in the world in Georgian times, bringing to life the people who walked its most notorious and dangerous streets more than 200 years ago, revealing a time when women risked terrible injury and disfigurement in savage, illegal fights with no holds barred.
It was a dirty, nasty sport, and these women would have been pretty rough.
They fought with bare-knuckled fists for money and pride, and for the entertainment of a crowd hungry for violence.
These women would have to be tough in mind as well as in body, and not care about their appearance.
There were no rules at all, and it was over when it was over.
Throughout history, men and women have faced one another in personal combat. At close quarters, one-on-one, face-to-face. They fought for honour, to settle bitter disputes, for prowess, to prove courage and skill, and for sport, to win glory and respect. From the pageantry of the medieval tournament ground, through the deadly rituals of duelists on the field of honour, to the savage backstreet arena of the bare-knuckle prize ring. It's these worlds that Fight Club explores. The Georgian period was a time of huge expansion and change. It was a time of near constant war in almost every corner of the globe. From 1714 until the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837, British interests spread throughout the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Australasia, laying the foundations of an empire that would one day encompass a fifth of the world's population. This was the age of enlightenment and reason, yet it was also an age of upheaval. Trade and commerce had brought great wealth to Britain, but the industrial and agricultural revolutions spelled massive change. The majority of working people were newly urbanised in overcrowded industrial inner cities, and the gap between fabulous wealth and extreme poverty had never been wider. Nowhere was this more the case than in the city of London.
London is an amazing city. It became a world city in less than 100 years, and a city that grew from 500,000 people to well over 1 million by the time Victoria arrived on the throne. Lots of people thought it was a monster, although it was minuscule compared to how big it is now. Areas were so distinct and the people differed in each area, and you get this incredible mix and a real sense of dynamism and vibrancy. That energy that was created in the 18th century is the energy that we have about London now, I think. It's still with us, and that's one of the really special things about the city.
Writer and blogger Lucy Inglis is fascinated by the Georgian period and how her home city of London changed and grew through the 18th and early 19th centuries. It was during the course of her research into these times that she first became captivated by the backstreet world of the everyday Georgian Londoners. A world in which lords and commoners alike found their entertainment in bawdy, smoky, crowded theatres and alehouses, or in the dark, cobbled streets and alleyways, which hid a world of gambling, drinking, prostitution, and above all, fighting. It seems Londoners loved a fight, from vicious animal blood sports to bare-knuckle prize fighting. And it's this bloodthirsty appetite which led to the grim spectacle of woman fighting woman on the streets of the richest city in the world. It seems inconceivable now, more than 2 centuries later. It's this world that Lucy Inglis feels driven to investigate. The London Library in St James's Square is one of the United Kingdom's leading research institutions. It's also the world's largest lending library and a vital resource for Lucy's detective work.
Good morning, Lucy. Welcome to the London Library. Do come in, let me show you around. Okay, let's go through to the steps. The library was founded by Thomas Carlyle because he wanted to be able to read some of the riches that you'd see in a national library, in a national collection, but he wanted to be able to take them home and use them at home.
The library stacks are housed in a giant cast steel framework of floors and shelves, which allows air to circulate around the books.
And these grilled floors were one of the first steel structures in London, and they go all the way down to the basement, and the books span the 16th century to the present day, and there's 1 million volumes for you to browse.
95% of these 1 million volumes are available to researchers to borrow, just like any other lending library. They're not hidden away in dusty archives, but unlike a conventional library, the books aren't routinely thinned or weeded to save space. Everything is kept for posterity. This unique collection has been used by some of Britain's best-known writers and historians: Thackeray, Henry James, T.E. Lawrence, J.M. Barrie. Tennyson researched the Maud Arthur here.
The shelving arrangement is unique. It was devised by Sir Charles Hagberg Wright, and it's an alphabetical way of dividing and organising information into subjects which are then very browsable. And it's one of the things members like yourself, writers, researchers, people who just love books really value, is the opportunity to be able to browse, because you do happen across things you would never think to look up from a catalogue record.
In researching Georgian London here, Lucy finds she has literally walked in the footsteps of perhaps the greatest writer ever to describe the everyday lives and characters of 18th and 19th century Britain.
We happen to be at H Revolutions, but there is also a H French Revolutions. H stands for history, and that area would have been used by Dickens when he was doing his research for Tale of Two Cities.
It's incredible to think that Charles Dickens did his research here in this building. One of my favourite things about Dickens is that he was a little boy in Georgian London, and that's what he very often writes about. But people think that he is the Victorian author, when in fact lots of it is drawn from characters, people and places in Georgian London.
Using the same volumes and periodicals that Dickens himself may have used in his own research, Lucy is able to put together a picture of the lives of ordinary Londoners and try to understand how it was that brutal prize fighting for women was tolerated. It's difficult now to look back on Georgian times with 21st century eyes. Yet Lucy finds that just like today, it was a society deeply riven with serious social problems, and some things never seem to change.
Alcohol was part of daily life for pretty much everybody in Georgian London and Georgian England as a whole. People self-medicated with alcohol. It was used as a way of getting enough calories in through beer or wine. It was used as a proper medical cure for various disorders. So people were very familiar with drinking pretty much throughout the day.
In the early Georgian period, the kind of alcohol you could afford to drink reflected your status in society.
Spirits had been the preserves of rich men, because spirits essentially meant brandy or fortified wine in the sense of port that would get you very drunk, and those were all imported, so they cost lots of money, and ordinary people couldn't afford them. So beer and bad wine were really the drinks of the ordinary folk.
By the 1740s though, there was a new, highly intoxicating spirit that even the lowest of the low could afford to drink.
Gin was very much the preserve of poor drinkers. To become a distiller was cheap to set up, and it was cheap to operate. You weren't regulated in the same way that other victuallers or vintners were. Then, because gin distilling can use bad grain that can't be used for beer or bread, then that second-rate grain was suddenly, the government had an answer for it. It could be used, and it was turned into gin.
In the mid-18th century, there was a huge increase in gin drinking across the nation. It became known as the gin craze. Strong liquor that was cheaply produced and cheap to consume was readily available in the thousands of new gin shops that sprang up across London and other British cities, irrespective of a drinker's gender or social background.
And the interesting thing about gin, it was also, gin was sold in gin shops, which were very often people's front rooms, and both men and women set up selling gin, whereas in other alcohol retail it was mainly dominated by men. And so if you're drinking in someone's front room, there's not really the social stigma. You can drink with other men and women can drink together and then get very drunk. And so you had, in a very short time period from the 1720s, this what other people saw as a breakdown in morals and even society itself, with the introduction of this supremely intoxicating substance. So it's very famous that people would have said you would drunk for a penny and dead drunk for 2 pence.
Former surgeon Mick Crumplin is an expert on medical techniques throughout history. He studied how the health of everyday people in the past was affected by the hazards of the times they lived through.
Well, I think the greatest impact of gin in Britain, and we know that it had a big impact because the mortality at the end of the 18th century started to fall when there were legal changes to restrict the sale of gin and tax it and so forth. The mortality fell, so it had a significant effect on the British population. It was one of the provision of hospitals, and the relative abstinence from gin made a huge difference in society.
Women or men involved in bare-knuckle fighting, exposure to gin would have been a dangerous hazard, both to long-term health and short-term performance in the prize ring.
Poor performance in any sort of combat or skilled work is enhanced by chronic alcoholism, and gin lane was there, and a penny a pint or whatever, it was an easy way to die. Get chronic liver poisoning and stomach ulceration, and as I say, performance was not enhanced in anything they did.
One of Britain's best-known artists of the Georgian period was fully aware of the impact of gin on the daily life of Londoners. William Hogarth produced paintings and etchings which didn't shrink from showing the realities of life on Gin Lane.
William Hogarth was not only one of our greatest artists, he was a social commentator, and that's something he took very seriously. He felt it was his duty to educate people through art about humanity, which was something he felt very strongly about on the streets of London. If you look at his work, very often it's quite exaggerated and it falls into the realms of caricature, but you do get a glimpse of the extremes that were on the streets at that time.
Hogarth's paintings and etchings provide a detailed and profound impression of what life must have been like for the people of Georgian London. Several of his works also show how alcohol combined with another great addiction in Georgian England, once more irrespective of gender or social class.
In the 18th century, gambling becomes this phenomenon. It's almost like a fever. Cards become quite solitary, aggressive games of chance, which, when exaggerated by lots of men sitting around, and women sometimes drinking, they become very absorbed, and that's how these enormous wagers were made. There are lots of debates that went on throughout the city on whether lotteries should be allowed, on whether cards was an acceptable social pastime. So that gambling culture filtered down all the way down through almost every pastime that could be bet upon.
Among the most popular things to bet on were the blood sports.
Everybody would go to cockfighting. You would have the Duke and the poor man, as long as they could pay the entry fee, and they would all enjoy that sport together, which is a great social leveller. It's probably the only one which encompasses every single social class.
It's against this intoxicating atmosphere of alcoholism, compulsive gambling, and the social classes intermingling that tastes in popular entertainment became more and more base and extreme. Bare-knuckle fighting becomes very popular, both as yet another thing to bet on and also as a bloodthirsty spectacle.
Bare-knuckle boxing has always been a thing that happened all the way through the ages, but it became much more of an urban phenomenon at the end of the 17th century, when you had cockfighting, horse baiting, bull baiting, and man against man was just part of the experience.
Bare-knuckle fighting was the biggest sport in England. In the 1820s, it would explode into what became known as Regency Boxomania. It was mainly the preserve of male participants and spectators, but, as Lucy has found, it wasn't a world inhabited exclusively by men.
The bare-knuckling was what everyone came to see and to gamble on. That was where the high stakes were played. But it would have been quite unusual for women to go, unless they were quite rough women, to be present at bare-knuckle fights. However, that didn't stop them competing.
Some women fought in the bare-knuckle prize ring. It was always regarded as a bit of a curio, and it seems not to have happened in the Victorian era, or if it did, it hasn't come down to us. But in the 18th century, there was some women's fighting. We even have reports of women fighting.
Yet compared to countless records of men's bare-knuckle prize fighting, the reports of women's fighting are few and far between. Lucy pieces together what's known.
There were mainly two types of women who would have competed as bare-knuckle fighters, and the first is quite a respectable woman, usually married to a sporting man, and their fights were quite heavily regulated, and they held money in their hands so that their fists had to stay clenched, and that then as soon as they dropped one of the coins in their hands, the fight was over. So it was quite a formal sport. However, that's not really the type of boxing that was so massively popular for women in the 18th century, which was the stripped down, hair pulling, kicking, no holds barred fighting that went on in some of the really rough areas of London.
If you knew where and when to look in Georgian London, you'd be able to find the women's fights. Part sporting contest, part grudge match. There was always an element of illicit spectacle about them. They were known as catfights.
Catfighting was very often held on a Saturday or a Monday afternoon, and it would often be women from the same community with grudges against one another. It was always, she has said this to me and I must have my revenge. In the smaller communities, word would get round that one woman had crossed another or stolen her husband or her boyfriend or anything, and then 2 days later they would meet.
It's these smaller communities that give Lucy a clue to find out more about the catfights. Not only who was fighting, but also who was watching.
The main spectators would be people from the surrounding streets. London was very much about neighbourhood communities, and so word would spread out to a certain point, and that local community, anyone with an interest in that community would be the type of spectator. But it was quite well known that near Tottenham Court Road on a Saturday night there would be women fighting.
Just near to Tottenham Court Road, was the infamous St Giles district of London.
Generally, you find lots of records to do with disturbances in St Giles in the Fields, and from the Irish community in particular. And also the areas that were very popular for bare-knuckle fighting, which was essentially the corner from Tottenham Court Road and then where it meets Oxford Street, that corner, and lots of these fights took place in that area.
Even in the London Library, written records related to the individual women involved in catfighting are extremely rare, so Lucy focuses instead on the communities from which they came. It leads her to one of the worst areas in Georgian London.
It's very difficult now to look back and to know who was fighting in these catfights, because they weren't the sort of things that were documented particularly well. However, when they are documented, it's usually the Irish community of St Giles that the women came from.
St Giles in the Fields Church is one of the last reminders of this dark period in London's 18th century past. It once marked the entranceway to the notorious maze of rundown streets beyond. It was a no-go area for all but those who had no choice but to live and work there. It was known as the Rookery.
The Rookery of St Giles came about because outside of the City of London, the St Giles in the Fields was one of the very early developments. And at the beginning it was quite grand. So you get these large houses built on the medieval timber frames. And then the fire to the east in 1666 wiped out most of that style of housing. But St Giles remains. So when London is rebuilt, the housing is thought to be generally of better quality, and it's certainly better provided with sanitation and running water. So people want to live in the newer housing, not the older housing. And so these medieval buildings get really run down and dilapidated, and the timbers are blackened through soot and smoke, and they become very rickety and they start to lean into one another, and very often you have struts and poles holding walls apart to stop two houses falling into one another, and they look like blackened nests, the big messy nests that you see in the trees when you get an enormous rookery. And of course there's that sense of them being sinister, and everything that comes out of them is black and dirty and scavenging, and that is why they're called rookeries.
St Giles was just one of several rookeries across London in the 18th century. Others included Old Nichol Street and Jacob's Island in Bermondsey, later immortalised by Charles Dickens in Oliver Twist. Dickens witnessed for himself the squalid conditions on a nocturnal tour of the rookeries, but only with a heavy Scotland Yard escort. They were home to the poorest, most desperate people in London, and they were a haven for criminals. The expanding city needed manual labour, something the Irish of St Giles had plenty of.
In the late 17th century, London was going through the very start of the boom, and they needed physical workers, manual labourers, to fuel this boom. And the Irish, because they were naturally healthy and fit and had grown up in Ireland in very rural conditions, did not suffer from the respiratory problems and general weaknesses that often affected native-born Londoners.
I think if we're looking at the life for womanhood, particularly poor women in the metropolis, particularly in an immigrant population as the Irish coming in or those from Europe, they would have nothing. They would arrive in tatters, and they would make their money by becoming prostitutes or cheap labourers, and any opportunity to make a quick buck by becoming a prize fighter, no doubt would be tempting to some, but that person would have to have an immense physique and be mentally very tough. Her life expectancy normally without fighting would be probably around 40 years of age, and the number of women who died in childbirth or who lost more than half their children, it was a pretty tough existence. So to fight, you'd have to perhaps not have family responsibilities and have fairly low intelligence and a great muscular physique.
Irish men and women in Georgian London would certainly be inured to hard work. They provided the extra backbone needed for a city that was expanding at a rate never before seen.
So the Irish, traditionally, Irish men had always come over to harvest hay around London, in the fields around London, and then they could get into London to have a good time. And this fitted very neatly with the potato crop. So they would plant the potatoes, leave the women behind to watch the crop. They would come over, earn money, and then they would go back for the harvest, their own harvest. But when they started to find work, particularly as sedan chair carriers and paving London, which was going on all the time. I mean, the roads have been very rough, but in the 18th century, paving became a big thing. They tended to stay, and when they stayed, their families came over with them. And so you go from having a large but temporary Irish population, which came and caused trouble but then went home. You have a large stable population, a population that is not going home. And that's one of the things that Londoners found very, very difficult to deal with. They didn't like it. And also the Irish that came tended to be Roman Catholic, and London has traditionally been prejudiced against Roman Catholicism. So you had lots and lots of social routines and norms amongst this poor Irish population, such as the laying out of the dead for extended periods of time, very drunken wakes. Keeping a pig was a sign of the fact that you could provide for your family. So in these extremely crowded courts and slums, people would keep at least one pig, and it was affected the water supply because the mess and everything else. And it was hugely, this behaviour, those two behaviours in particular, the laying out of the dead and the pigs, became an enormous social stigma and a big problem. People talked about it constantly. It comes up constantly in records. So we must now look back and think that must have been pretty bad for them to be so obsessed with it. But if you think about it from our modern point of view, laying out a body for at least a week or even longer, because very often they were so poor that they could not afford the fees to bury that body, and the money would be brought by visitors. So literally the body stayed there until enough money had come in for the funeral. And sadly there are instances where bodies became infectious and infected the people who were visiting, and there were deaths. So these things in the 18th century, when you are getting much more social awareness, public consciousness, these behaviours were seen as threatening to society and literally threatening to health and public order.
The customs they brought with them may have caused friction with the locals, but it was the living conditions in the rookery that provided the greatest enemies for the impoverished Irish residents. It's difficult now to imagine just how squalid living conditions were in St Giles.
I think the disease pattern in sort of close communities where dysentery would be the most common, bowel infection with typhoid or bacillary dysentery. And then there was tuberculosis, which when the census started, deaths and disease in the 1830s, tuberculosis or consumption or spitting blood was the commonest cause of death amongst the civilian population. So you have bowel infection and then you have tuberculosis. And of course many other problems such as lice and occasionally outbreaks of typhus or typhoid. Typhus caused by louse infection, and the rickettsia organism which lives in the gut of the louse can cause irritation to the skin, which when you scratch it, the rickettsia goes into your body and causes the infection with fever, joint pains, unwellness and so on. Typhoid is a general febrile illness with rashes and unwellness and enlarged spleen. And these were everyday hazards to these people, which we don't see today because we have good treatment for the disease or inoculation to protect us from them.
With little to look forward to, but a life spent in poverty and death at the hands of alcoholism or disease, women fighters were the lowest of the low in Georgian London.
The women who would have fought in these really basic bare-knuckle competitions were fairly dirty in their general appearance, and something like they would have worn probably very basic linen, leather corsets, quite ragged skirts. And the caricatures of the time always have them in very ragged skirts, but maybe not even shoes, to be honest. That's how poor they were. So their appearance was kind of the lowest sort of social strata of the Georgian period.
The locations for the fights were usually the back streets of St Giles. At this time, little better than insanitary open sewers. Even before the fight began, there were health hazards everywhere.
Well, I think the environment in which these women would have to fight in the sort of so-called boxing ring or cockpit or pub or anywhere in the street, the whole environment would be filthy. There would be animals, on the street and being kept in the house or in the backyard, and cadaveric material lying around and human excrement, and all this would give rise to a much larger bacterial population in the environment of the combat. And this is why infection, even in a tiny wound, could be so risky. And I think that these women probably would be presumably fighting somewhere between their late teens, but probably not beyond their 30s.
With the majority of fighters being young women, often whose only means of earning a living was prostitution, inevitably, the male crowds, fueled by drink, wanted to see more than just the fight.
It was very common for the poor women to fight stripped to the waist, and this, of course, attracts spectators. Corsets were usually leather, because they just needed something that was extremely hard wearing. And if you get a leather corset, you can just swing someone round by it because it's not going to give at all. So there's not really any point in using those, because you just end up pulling each other about. And, people wanted to see the tits. Yeah. These fights were pretty serious. Lots of damage done to chests and breasts and faces, and hair pulling, and really very aggressive. And it was over when someone gave in. So there were no rules at all.
No doubt it would deteriorate from fisticuffs into grabbing people's hair and clothing and scratching, and it would get out of control very quickly. It would be a very unpleasant contest indeed. And there are many types of injury you can inflict on somebody else, both on the impact of the fist on the body, and causing anything from a broken cheekbone to a broken nose to an eye injury to a soft tissue throat injury to a broken ribs, depending on the force of the blow. But for the deliverer, there was also a high risk, because if you hit someone in the jaw or mouth, or there was bone exposed or teeth, there is a veritable soup of bacteria in these people's mouths. And if they were in the habit of drinking a lot of gin, and very poor dental hygiene, so most of them suffered with pyorrhea, which is, infection around the gums because of lack of proper teeth cleaning and so on. The chance of getting an infection in the knuckles was extremely high, and there would be broken bones both in the phalanges, the small bones of the hand, and in the bigger metacarpals. And if you get compound fractures of the heads of the metacarpals, that will lead to poor healing, secondary infection, even death sometimes from spreading infection from the limb up the arm. And so there were risks both to those being hit, and women particularly had an awful lot of fatty areas on their body compared to men. They were less evident with their muscles, so I suppose a bruising would be very common indeed. It would be very hard to fracture somebody's skull, but possible with a thin skull, perhaps on the side here in the temporal region. Broken nose is common, eyebrows and the bone above the eye driven in, the zygoma or cheekbone driven in and impacted would give rise to deformity, and of course loss of teeth, although being edentulous or without teeth at this age due to poor hygiene or trauma was very common. And then, of course, you have the fractured jawbones or mandible, which might make chewing difficult and such like things like that.
We don't have any records of a fight to the death between women in the Georgian period, but they would certainly have died probably relatively young and from entirely preventable diseases, just engendered by poverty and lifestyle.
Despite such grim prospects and consequences, the lifestyle of a catfighter still held a strong appeal for many young women.
Female bare-knuckle fighters may have been extremely poor, but they also had the ability to earn relatively a lot of money in a very short space of time. I mean, as much, if not more, as they would earn as prostitutes. So they owned that ability.
Yet money alone doesn't explain it. Lucy believes there was something else. Something that ran deep in the closed immigrant community of the Irish.
One of the things that we don't seem to necessarily recognise now is that poverty had its own identity. People were not just poor, they owned their poor identity, and they very often created it. They often could afford at stages in their lives not to dress in extremely ragged fashions, but they continued to do that. There are lots of examples of women in particular who were quite successful as fish women in the streets and that sort of thing, but still maintained this poor identity. It was very much a look on the streets of London.
Such poverty eventually drew the attention of some of the very first pioneers of social welfare. It was the beginning of a change in attitudes to the poor that would eventually bring an end to the ghetto-like rookeries such as St Giles.
In the late 18th century, a man called Matthew Martin was very interested in finding out the causes of being truly poor. And he started on Piccadilly an experiment called the Mendicity Office. And he gave out tokens in the street, and if you came to the office and submitted to an interview, you would receive money. It was pennies, but it changed over time. And so many people came. And he gathered enormous amounts of information on the poor, who they were, where they came from, whether they were married, single, how many dependents they had.
It was this work that for the first time revealed exactly who among the poor were most in need. The very same people who could have found themselves in the catfighting arenas.
Women are about 90% of the people who came. A huge proportion of these women were Irish. Matthew Martin suspected that many of these women had never been married or had just been deserted by a husband who no longer wanted to support the family. And that became an enormous social concern, that the Irish were coming over to this country and were taking charity, which they did take large amounts of charity. And then the big fear that was not only would they either stay here and drink that money, the idea was that then they would leave and go home. There were lots of stories about poor Irish arriving home in Dublin, but with all the charity money sewn into their clothes, because that's what people wanted to believe. And so this social stigma just grew and grew and grew, and by about 1820 it was an enormous problem, even though by and large social conditions had improved massively from 100 years before.
The work of Matthew Martin and the Mendicity Office was decades ahead of its time and set in motion the slow process of social reform that continued on throughout the 19th century. In Victorian times, no-holds-barred bare-knuckle fighting grew steadily out of favour, but especially involving women. Yet one woman's reputation as a fighter still holds high above the catfighters and gutter brawlers, and she was no Irish woman.
Elizabeth Stokes does represent the organised side, the professional side of female bare-knuckle fighting. She married James Stokes, the pugilist, and she made a career of challenging other well-known women fighters. Usually they were women who had other jobs, and they were big staged events. They were advertised in all the newspapers, and Liz Stokes is particularly famous because she was a Cockney. They called her the Cockney Championess. So she's particularly famous for being a Londoner and married to a Londoner. She was originally from Clerkenwell.
Elizabeth Stokes, who became known as Lady Bare-Knuckles, set herself up as a cut above the catfighters of St Giles and the other rookeries. Newspaper adverts for a fight still exist, in which it's made clear that the combatants were properly and modestly clothed. Stokes was no topless catfighter.
In contrast to the very poor fighters, who obviously didn't want to spoil their clothes and were giving a big show, Liz Stokes definitely didn't want you to think that you were coming to see that type of fight. She fought in a close, tight jacket of quite coarse material, short skirt just below the knee, which then would have breeches worn underneath, and pumps. And that was the way that women boxed well into the 19th century. She set that model.
Though the era of modern women's boxing was still more than 2 centuries in the future, Elizabeth Stokes was the first superstar British woman fighter.
I think Liz Stokes probably is the first great female bare-knuckle fighter. She's certainly the first one that we have proper records of. That's not to say that there certainly would have been women who were fighting beforehand, but I think also she sets the bar quite high because she was surrounded by professional men, her husband and his cohorts, who did this properly for a living. So she transformed it into a very marginal sport for women, both socially, culturally and literally, and brought it into mainstream arenas where men competed for money.
The great changes sweeping Georgian Britain continued apace into the early 19th century. The popularity of men's bare-knuckle prize fighting grew to an all-time high at all levels of society, and even the Prince Regent himself was an avid fan. Yet by this time, Elizabeth Stokes was long gone, and the era in which wild female catfights could be tolerated was on the wane. Things were changing.
The high point of the Georgian era is the Regency in terms of art, culture, everything else, and that is when you start to see the decline of women fighting in the public eye. That sort of thing would be frowned upon, rather than a fun thing to watch. Or even a valid thing to watch. It would have been very, very disapproved of. But again, it doesn't stop the bare-knuckle fights amongst the poorer communities still happening, both for money and grudge matches.
Within a few decades, and the end of the Georgian era, prize fighting even for men was in decline, and the women's had completely drifted into legend. With the great slum clearances of Victorian times, the rookeries disappeared, and the squalid London described by Charles Dickens and William Hogarth was no more. Yet the women who fought with bare knuckles more than 200 years ago are still there, just beneath the modern streets, where Georgian London still remains. Only a fighter knows what goes through the mind before a fight. The preparations, the rituals to mask the fear. Fear of these last moments of uncertainty before it's time to face the crowd. It's the mid-1800s in Victorian Britain, and the fight is on. Now, more than 160 years later, we turn back the clock to the extraordinary times of the Victorian period. Investigating the forgotten world of the first mass sporting phenomenon that the country had ever known. Revealing the men who rose from the humblest of working class origins to become the greatest sporting superstars of their day.
The punches these guys would land, I suspect, had enormous force.
The bare-knuckle fighters of the prize ring fought for the roar of the crowd, lords and commoners alike. And at the height of the 19th century, they fought for the honour to be the very first undisputed champion of the world.
I'll give you a target, but I'll have your head.
Throughout history, men and women have faced one another in personal combat. At close quarters, one-on-one, face-to-face. They fought for honour, to settle bitter disputes, for prowess, to prove courage and skill, and for sport, to win glory and respect. From the pageantry of the medieval tournament ground, through the deadly rituals of duelists on the field of honour, to the savage backstreet arena of the bare-knuckle prize ring. It's these worlds that Fight Club explores. Victorian times saw change like no other period before or since. From 1837 to nearly the end of the 19th century, Britain saw vast industrial expansion, the arrival of electricity, and the huge growth of the railways. It saw the discovery of penicillin, pasteurisation, and antiseptic. It saw the rise of the middle classes, mass production in factories, and the Great Reform Acts. Above all, it was a time when Britain grew into an empire, ruled over by a great queen whose subjects ranged from the Highlands of Scotland to the Himalaya, and from the Horn of Africa to the Arctic Circle. For most people in Britain, work was relentless. Entertainment, for the most part, meant the music hall or the pub. Alcoholism was rife, and this was a society used to violence.
If you look at society, you tend to understand that everyone is surrounded by alcohol, whether you drink gallons of Somerset in the southwest of England, or beer in the pubs of London, or crude spirits in the north of Scotland. It's what civilian society did for escapism. They had nothing else, and it was cheap and easily available and often home brewed, and so therefore impure and dangerous. So society, both in terms of a civilian combat and fighting and brawling and family life, as well as in the military, were often punctuated by huge hiccups of poor behaviour flamed up by alcohol.
The mass appeal of sports we know today was still in the future, with the rise of football and cricket in the late 19th century. Instead, people followed traditional sports dating back hundreds of years, horse racing and the blood sports. Yet one thing drew more spectators than anything else.
But bare-knuckle fighting is presumably the oldest sport of all. It seems naturally to be the case. How do two men naturally vie with each other? By fighting. and bare-knuckle fighting is that much more visceral than gloved fighting, less rule-bound, and altogether rather bloodier.
There were no gloves, no set number of rounds, and very few rules. Bare-knuckle fighting was the #1 sport in early Victorian Britain.
Bare-knuckle is fighting. There's a lot of skill involved. I mean, they were men who fought to the death, almost. In fact, a lot of them did die in the ring and just outside it. They fought for maybe 100 rounds sometimes, but they weren't 100 3-minute rounds like we have nowadays. A round ended when the man went down.
It had changed little in millennia, and despite its bloody nature, it was known as the noble art. Fist fighters were among the most highly regarded athletes in the ancient world, and date back to the original Olympics. Nearly 3,000 years later, the sport still survives today, but only in underground competitions. Shorus Wallace has spent a career fighting on the big screen in movies such as Highlander, Braveheart and Gladiator. In his early days, he was a bare-knuckle fighter in Scotland.
We say bare-knuckle fighter, but it was a different term when I was doing it, but it's called bare-knuckle fighting now, you know. We call it the fair go, or the square go, a bit like the gypsy fighting. Well, the background to get into this type of fighting is as vast and varied as there is people, and everybody will have a different reason. Many of the people I know, I suppose now you would call it a deprived background. I didn't think I come from a deprived background because I didn't know anything different, but I know you had to fight, you know. And the guys who used to fight maybe 100, 150 years ago, what you get in that situation is generally a sense of unwritten honour between the fighters. And where you don't get that respect to give and respect given to you in the society that you're brought up in, you find in abundance in the ring.
In Victorian Britain, bare-knuckle fighting would reach its zenith in 1860. Up to this point, its popularity had always fluctuated. Controversy and scandal were never far away.
Bare-knuckle prize fighting begins at the turn of the 17th century, and then it develops through to the mid-18th century, when it really becomes a properly organised sport, patronised by royalty, aristocracy, and then it gets its first set of rules in the 1740s. It has a great dip in the 1760s because of the plethora of fixed fights. Then it's rescued again in the 1780s when you get some more honest fighters and the royal and aristocratic patronage comes back. It builds up steadily until by the Regency period, the early 19th century, it becomes hugely popular.
The Regency was the springboard for the great changes of the Victorian era. In 1811, King George III was deemed unfit to rule, and the Prince of Wales stood in his place. It was a time of extremes, from great upheaval for the working class to the wild excesses of the aristocracy. And they all loved their boxing.
The Regency period was the golden age. There was, first of all, there were people who were interested in it, who had money. They had boxers, they didn't train them, but they owned them to some extent. People would have racehorses nowadays. And if you had skill, you made good money. It's possible to become very wealthy.
It's never exactly respectable. It's of the upper echelons of society, it's the Regency bucks who are the fans. Lord Byron, for example, was a great admirer of boxing, was himself an amateur boxer.
The Regency bucks were the lifeblood of the bare-knuckle scene, and the centre of it all was London. In the early part of the 19th century, London was a wonder of the world. Huge expansion created gaslit streets, palaces, and mile after mile of brick-built houses and railways. The works of French artist Paul Gustave Doré captured this London just a few decades later. The London prize ring was the mecca for all bare-knuckle fighters, and they came to try their hand from all across Britain. The rolling valleys of Herefordshire were as much a contrast as you could get from grimy, smog-bound London. It was from here that one young lad began his ascent to become the first great champion that Britain ever produced.
Tom Winter, or Tom Spring as he became later, was one of the fighters who lived in a beautiful landscape.
Author and historian John Hurley has researched the life of Tom Spring. Born in 1795, the young Spring grew up in the shadow of war with Napoleonic France.
He didn't have to fight, but like a lot of people, he wants to get away from home. And one occasion his father, who was a bit of a feckless character, came back and he saw young Tom holding the hands of a recruiting officer, taking him down the garden path underneath the apple trees to take him in to fight for Wellington, be a drummer boy. And the father said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, your son wants to come and join the army and be a drummer boy." So old, Spring Senior saw him off with a few neat left hooks. And the recruiting officer ran away. But you see, even then, he wasn't unhappy at home, but he wanted to leave home.
After evading the King's shilling, Spring's early years were spent around Farnhope, where he had his first training with his fists.
Farnhope is a mile or so down the road here. So Tom Spring's early life was about 2 square miles. So I suppose that would be the same as any kid now living in a high-rise block in London. Their whole life would be around that few miles. And he worked hard in his father's butcher shop. He went to school, he learned to read and write, and he wrote very well. His handwriting still exists. Because his father was a boxer and taught him how to box, and he made him punch the bag in hanging off the apple tree and all that.
Boxing was one way a working-class lad like Spring could make a name for himself around the local villages. Just as in London, some of the most avid fight fans were the local gentry.
The Duke of Norfolk would bring them along and give them a damn good meal for fighting. And a good meal for those young lads in those days was very important. So they looked forward to the boxing. There was a queue to get in.
It was after one of these sparring bouts that the young Tom Spring's life changed forever.
This is where it happened, where the River Lug flows into the River Wye. His whole life changed when he was having an amateur boxing match here against the Hammer Hollands, a sort of a kind of comic villain. He was a guy of about 29, his scarred face, and he'd had lots of fights, but he was a bit of a boozer, etc. And he hated Spring. Spring was good looking.
This time, it wasn't just the locals watching. Among the crowd was one of London's most legendary bare-knuckle boxers, Tom Cribb.
The two of them were fighting here, and Tom Cribb was sitting over there in a bale of straw, drinking his Guinness with his old sparring partners, near the end of his career. And he was watching this kid and thinking, he's good, you know. So when the fight was over, he went up to him and said, I can make a star of you if you come to London.
Spring didn't need asking twice. He was headed for the big city.
Basically, hardly lived anywhere outside of that. He probably lived within 5 miles of that little place. Suddenly, he's on a hay wain or something coming to London, at the age of 18. London then was narrow streets, pitch dark, smog, rubbish tips burning, prostitutes screaming. In fact, you could find a dead body dangling from a lamppost. You know, it was that bad, it was that primitive. And after living in Herefordshire with its lovely valleys and the River Wye, he was coming here to a nightmare. But obviously he wanted to come, he wanted to leave home, he didn't have to, he wasn't forced to. And Cribb obviously said the right things to him in Herefordshire when he met him, that he was going to make him a star, as it were. And he found the pub. Don't ask me how he found the pub, you know, it was way before Staten Ave. And Spring arrived, the building he arrived at was about 5 doors away down the street here, and very close at hand.
At Cribb's pub in Piccadilly, Spring took to his new routine straight away.
His routine was training and helping Cribb run the pub. So his training was running, hitting the big old bag of sawdust, not the sparring, that came later, but just getting himself fit, because he hadn't done much fighting or training or anything else for a while. It was a brilliant idea, getting him actually up and running.
The place to go for up-and-coming fighters in London was the Fives Court. It was here that boxers, trainers and fans all mingled, and where they could have a look at new prospects like Spring.
Cribb was well used to that place. He was an idol there. When he walked in, everyone cheered, even at 10 years after he retired. So he brought his boy in. They're all the murmur amongst the toffs. Oh, it's his Cribb's boy. Let's have a look at him. And then some of the boxers were saying, God, he looks a bit handy. So there were boxers looking admiringly, you know, who knew what they were talking about, at this young lad in the ring with good fighters. So Tom was the star. No matter who he was boxing, even a grizzled professional, he would more than hold his own. And the crowd would be applauding, getting excited. All the gentry looking down from the top, saying, gosh, look at that guy. Let's get a bet on him for the next contest.
Spring impressed everybody with his elegant style. He was one of the first of a new kind of athletic fighter, using quick skills as opposed to old-fashioned slugging power.
As the fight begins or progresses, I start to see lines of geometry. You know, I can see them, I can see ways in. And I fight as an action-reaction fighter. What that means to me is, I'll come forward for you, but I'm actually sucking you in. And as you think I'm making my move, I'm waiting on your first move, and I'll give you a target. I'll give you something that you really want, but I'll have your head. And no matter where you go, I'll give you a kidney, I'll give you a spleen, I'll give you a rib shot, which is one that it's hard to get up from. But if you've got that, I have got your head. That's principally how I begin, that's how I think. I was a lucky fighter. But the same principle, no matter whether I was in boxing or martial arts, the square go club or bare-knuckle boxing, it was the same principle. And all my life I've seen the geometry of people coming towards me, male or female, and I just adopted that for the ring, and I enjoyed it,
It wasn't long before Spring established himself, and in 1823 he was poised to challenge for the title against notorious heavyweight Bill Neate.
Now, Bill Neate was a knockout man. He didn't have much, but he had a big punch. He was a bit limited. He'd just take a bead on you and nail you as you went across the ring. But Spring had studied him, and he just outboxed him, had him hitting nothing more substantial than fresh air. And eventually, Neate was humiliated and gave in. So suddenly, Spring was champion, all very quickly.
Under the stewardship of Cribb, Tom Spring had become the British heavyweight champion. His title was enhanced in an epic fight with challenger Jack Langham in 1824 at Worcester Racecourse. 30,000 spectators came to watch. Some climbed the rigging of ships in the River Severn for a view. Others were injured when an overcrowded grandstand collapsed. Despite this fight mania, Spring knew when to call it a day. He retired the same year and never fought again. He was the last of the great champions of Regency times.
We're nearly there. Just around the corner. Here it is. Now, this is the old rustic monument in memory of the great Tom Spring, the local boy who became British champion, made from bits of an old cider mill and local stone from the Kapla quarry. You see, it's a wonderful piece of stone, and this was the original engraving here. It's got a bit lichened and blotchy, but you can still see it there. You've got the old stone that will never move again, but this moved and crushed the apples, dragged by a pony or a donkey. I can't read the inscription on the stone, so I'm going to read it from my book, if I may. Spring, Champion of England, 1823-24. Thou mighty master of the milling set, more potent far than any that have met in PC ring, may Mars, who watches o'er the half-stripped votaries of the sawdust floor, protect thee still, and round thy laurels cling, while Cribb with iron lungs shouts, "Go it, Spring!" I love that bit. Basically, I think he was forgotten. There were a few people around who had a few bob to put together to buy him a very simple and very suitable memorial. This being the land of cider, they thought, let's have a cider press. And it's still here. It's not forgotten. People come here. There's now a Tom Spring walk all around these fields, which winds up here, where you can have a glass of cider with Tom.
It was more than 120 years after his death that Spring was finally recognised as the true champion he was.
They didn't have ratings as such, because the weights were all different, but for the first time there was a guy who won, beat a foreigner, i.e. an Irishman, and was basically officially the British champion, but could also be argued to be the world champion, first world champion. In 1992, Tom Spring was inducted into the World Boxing Hall of Fame with the greats. He's up there with Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Rocky Marciano, Joe Louis, Jack Johnson, all the greats. This lad who's got a bit of stone here commemorating him is one of the world's greatest fighters. And that's official.
One reason why fighters like Spring retired as soon as they could afford to was the sheer physical toll of bare-knuckle fighting. Former surgeon Mick Crumplin has researched the injuries inflicted by different types of historical combat, including bare-knuckle fighting.
The variety of injuries was enormous. A great deal of injury would fall around the face. These men would be very powerful, and although they could damage their unprotected hands, they could fracture your eyebrow, your nose, they could rip off an ear and lips and break teeth and smash the jaw. I mean, this is really very tough stuff indeed. And a blow to the neck, whether aimed or not, could even fracture the windpipe and the voice box just above it, and that would cause suffocation and bleeding into the neck. Then around the chest you could break a rib. It would have to be a very hard punch, probably more around the side and front lower down, but a fractured rib spike could go into the lung and puncture it and cause an air leak and bleeding into the chest, because the punches these guys would land, I suspect, had enormous force. And of course any damage to the arm, you probably wouldn't break the humerus bone or the shoulder. They're too strong and protected by muscles. But certainly the chest, neck and head with its appendages were very, very prone to severe damage. And it would depend how long you could go on.
Bare-knuckle fighters who earned 20 quid maybe 30 years ago, and they're earning like 20,000 now for a bare-knuckle fight, which will last about 15-20 minutes maximum. But there's an accumulation, whether you're defensive or offensive, there's an accumulation of injuries. They build up on you. Like I say, I've had basically a broken back. I've just went through about 6 operations. Really opening up my skull to realign my jaw, pull back my face. I mean, my nose is pure rubber, do you know? So it picks up on you.
As the Regency gave way to the Victorian age, life in Britain was very different to just a few decades before. The Regency books were a dying breed, and the London prize ring was reaching its climactic era, when it would take on a truly international dimension. Its last great champion was Tom Sayers.
Tom Sayers was born in 1826 in Brighton, into a slum area. His father was a shoemaker. His family was very, very poor. He had to make his own way in life. A little boy who went onto the beach, helped with cleaning boats, pushing boats out into the water and so on. But he had an elder sister who lived in London. Her husband had a building firm, and Tom went to London where he learned the trade of bricklayer. But he was very handy with his fists.
Like Spring in the decades before, Tom Sayers quickly drew attention on the London circuit.
His first fight goes well. It's only for £5 a side, but he wins. And this is how prize fighters got set up. They would have informal fights first. They would make a name in them. Then somebody would want to back them for £5 or £10 to fight somebody else at the beginning of his career. Sayers is successful, so he gets another fight for rather more money. He's successful in that, and more wealthy backers become interested in him. And finally, in the mid-1850s, he's running out of opponents of his own weight, because he's a middleweight. He's just about 5 foot 8 inches tall and about average build for that size. He runs out of opponents. He's too dangerous for other men of his own size. And so he tries to take on one of the big men of his day, but nobody thinks it's worthwhile. He's too small to fight the heavyweights.
Just when Sayers was on the verge of giving up, he got a fight. Paulson was one of the top heavyweights of his day. To everyone's surprise, Sayers took him on and beat him.
Then he gets through the other top heavyweights in England. He surprises everybody by defeating Bill Perry, the Tipton Slasher, the champion of his day. Perry, much bigger than Sayers, is sure he's going to beat him, stakes everything including his in on the fight, and loses.
Sayers was a marvel. He'd run out of people to fight. Yet England wasn't the only country in the world where prize fighting was big business. In the United States, John Carmel Heenan, or Jack Heenan, the Benicia boy, had also made a name for himself as a bare-knuckle fighter.
Jack Heenan was a bit happy-go-lucky, and left to his own devices, he might have done almost anything. He was a great gambler, and would have probably have tried to set up a gambling house, as he did later in his career, with mixed success. But when he was in California, Jim Cusick, who was an itinerant British boxing trainer and manager, took an interest in him. Took him back east to New York, where there was more money to be made with his fists, kept him on the straight and narrow, got him to fight for the championship.
Heenan became American champion, but just like Sayers, he outgrew his native land. It was his British manager who made the next step.
But Jim Cusick, as his manager, being himself British, could see possibilities by throwing out a transatlantic challenge. And it was Cusick was the main mover. So the challenge could only go to the big man, well, the small man, but the big man in terms of his reputation in England, who was Tom Sayers. And this was a brilliant idea on Cusick's part, because as soon as the challenge was sent out in 1859, people became really interested. People who had never been interested in the prize ring before, who in England particularly and in America couldn't have told you who the champion was. Suddenly the international dimension to this prize fight caught the public imagination on both sides of the Atlantic, and on both sides of the Atlantic it became an obsession.
It was like nothing before seen, and it came at a crucial time for prize fighting in England, which was nowhere near as popular as during the Regency.
It was extraordinary, completely unexpected that this should happen, but the prize ring, which had been in complete disrepute in England particularly for decades, suddenly it blazed brighter than ever before, and people could talk of nothing else. The papers went crazy over it. Even the Times, the Thunderer, felt obliged to cover the fight. They just couldn't ignore it because it was so popular. In America, the newspapers went crazy, and people would talk of nothing else.
It was the first case of newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic hyping up a sporting contest into a furore.
From the moment that Jack Heenan arrived in England, arrived in Liverpool, the main port for transatlantic crossings, in January 1860, everybody was crazy about it. There was a huge crowd waiting for him when he landed. Everybody knew he was coming. His train to London, there were crowds at the stations all along the way to see the great American champion.
As the two fighters concentrated on training, everybody was fascinated, including the great and the good.
The newspapers went crazy about it. The top echelons of society became interested, although they didn't like to admit it. Charles Dickens was fascinated. William Makepeace Thackeray was fascinated. The Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, who should have entirely looked down on such things, he was a great fan. And generally speaking, everybody was gripped by it, in America too.
Everybody wanted to know when the big fight was going to happen.
There was great speculation as to when the fight would come off, but it was illegal. So the police and the magistrates were supposed to stop it. In practice, they knew they couldn't stop it. It would have caused more than a riot. For one thing, there was so much money staked on the fight that it just had to go ahead. But every chief constable knew that he could be in trouble if the fight took place on his patch.
Finally, after months of speculation, the greatest fight show ever held was on.
Everybody knew when it was arranged because it had to be advertised in Bell's Life in London. People crowded into the sporting taverns that were named where they could buy tickets. There was such a crush that some people couldn't get to the bar to buy tickets for the fight because there had to be a limited number, limited to the places on the two trains that would leave London Bridge for the fight. And so everybody wanted to attend the fight, but not everybody could. People paid way over the odds for this return ticket to nowhere.
The police were determined to try and prevent the fight. They and everybody else had heard the rumours that the fight would take place in Brighton on the Reigate line, but no one knew for sure.
So when the two trains left London Bridge Station in the early hours of Tuesday, 17th April 1860, bare-knuckle prize fights always took place on a Tuesday for some reason, the police lined the track either way to make sure that the trains didn't stop there, the fight didn't take place on the patch of that particular chief constable. But of course the fight had to take place somewhere. And what happened was that at Reigate Junction, the pointsman had been paid off to suddenly change the points so that the trains would change direction, and off they went to Farnborough in Hampshire, where they stopped. And the police there, well, the police weren't waiting along that line, they were waiting further down the London Bridge line all the way to Brighton. They weren't waiting on the line to Farnborough.
The chase was on. While the police and magistrates tried to work out what had happened, the fight organisers knew they had little time to waste.
The two trains were enormously long, and they disgorged their passengers, some onto the platform at Farnborough, and some, well, they overshot the platform, so just onto the grass. And then they all had to follow the ring keeper to the pre-arranged location, of which very few people knew. And they had this cross-country hike. Some of them fell into the stream on the way. Others, the Americans were city dwellers, didn't know how dangerous nettles were and got badly stung.
Finally, the ring was set up and the fighters prepared.
The two men stripped for action to knee breeches, tight-fitting trousers from waist to knee, white stockings below them from covering the lower part of the leg, spiked fighting boots. Around the waist they both wore a brightly coloured large pocket handkerchief known as the colours for the fight. Spare colours were draped over a corner stake with the winner to take both. Then there were the initial formalities to be observed, including a toss for choice of corners, and then the fighting could begin. It all took a long time.
The crowd had to do what they could for a view. There were no seats, and some climbed trees to see what was going on.
The only people who had a privileged view of the fight, apart from the fight officials, like the referee whose place was outside the ring, and the two umpires, one for each man, the referee officiated between them, they were outside the ring. And then you had the designated reporters for the various newspapers, American and British, and they had a place close to the action. Then you had those who would sketch the fighters, and they of course had a privileged place so that they could see them. But otherwise, the spectators almost had to fight for a good view of the action.
When everything was ready, the two fighters threw their hats into the ring, and the fighting began.
Now in this fight, Tom Sayers was at a huge physical disadvantage. He was 5 inches shorter than John Carmel Heenan. He was 40 pounds lighter. He was 8 years older, mid-30s as opposed to mid-20s, so Sayers had to try to avoid wrestling whenever he could. And his seconds were constantly telling him to stay back to avoid getting into a clinch. But of course he couldn't all the time, and most rounds ended with Sayers down, either knocked down or being thrown. And so the various rounds were of indefinite length, going on until a man went down. So you could get a round lasting half a minute or a round lasting 15 minutes. And it went on and on, with Sayers generally ending a round by being knocked down, but he would often go down deliberately to take a breather, or because in a clinch he wanted to go down as quickly as possible to avoid too much damage. Sayers himself did tremendous damage to Heenan's face. Heenan was unrecognisable by the end of the fight. Sayers, in one of the early rounds, had his right arm damaged and couldn't use it for the rest of the fight.
Sayers, reduced to fighting one-handed, suffered one of the most debilitating hazards of bare-knuckle fighting.
We have to think about the weapons of infliction imposed by a bare-knuckle fighter, whether man or woman, and the force of the impact is your body weight plus the power thrown into the swing. And if you impart that to your hand, and most of us, if we tried it, would never throw a second punch. And all this stuff on Hollywood about them getting up or being knocked out cleanly, it's nonsense. If you hit someone very hard on the jaw, you may well damage him, but also you may well fracture the phalanges, injure the joints, and fracture the metacarpals or even the wrist bone in inflicting such damage. And these risks, because soft tissue injuries, if you strain a wrist joint, is just as painful as a fracture. So damage to hands must have been very, very common indeed, and there would have been healed fractures of the small long bones of the hand. There would have been early arthritis setting in after the joints had been disrupted. And that's just with clean, closed injury. If injuries were inflicted where the landing the blow opened the skin and exposed bone and broke the bone, you have a compound injury which doubles the mortality and infection rate and is extremely dangerous. So I'm sure a lot of people would have to modify their fighting according to that injury. And injuries take 3 or 4 months to heal, so they'd have been off if they had severe injury. Once they had healed, I suppose broken bones and wounded joints will be used again until the hand is quite disfigured.
As the fight wore on, both men were exhausted. It was then that things reached a climax that was savage, even by bare-knuckle prize ring standards.
Then it comes to round 37. Because rounds were of indefinite length and weren't formally counted, different reporters give you a different count for the rounds, but 37 is a fair compromise. Round 37, Heenan gets hold of Sayers, bends his neck over the top rope and leans on it. Sayers is going black in the face, and there are those, it said, who fear that Sayers will be strangled. The crowd converge on the ring. The ring keepers can't or won't keep them back. The ring is broken in, and the fight descends into chaos. Sayers is saved certainly from instant defeat, possibly some said from death.
There was nothing for it but to call the fight a draw. The arguments began immediately.
There was huge controversy at the end of the fight. The Americans claimed that Heenan was cheated of victory. The Brits claimed Sayers was cheated. Well, I've read every report of the fight, and I think it has to be admitted that Heenan was on the verge of victory. Whether it was strictly legal that he virtually tried to strangle Sayers at the end of the fight can be questioned, but the rules at the time didn't explicitly forbid it. And when the ring was broken in, almost certainly it saved Sayers from defeat. So although the Brits never quite admitted it, I think the truth is that Heenan had Sayers beat, but wasn't allowed to win. So the breaking in of the ring was perhaps, in fact was almost certainly, due to the fact that there were so many Brits there with a lot of money staked on Sayers and with a patriotic interest in seeing him win, that they weren't prepared to see him beaten. So I think we have to admit that Heenan, although Sayers so much smaller, so much lighter, so much older, was probably the better man in fighting one-handed, but Heenan really won the fight. He was cheated of victory.
Whatever the true result should have been, the controversy did nothing for the image of bare-knuckle fighting. The anything-goes days of the Regency were long gone.
It's an extraordinary business, this huge event in the bare-knuckle prize ring, which has made the prize ring phenomenally popular after it's been so unpopular for so long. After it, the prize ring virtually disappears. It disappears because for all that people are so fascinated by this fight, and there's tremendous controversy about it for weeks afterwards, who really won? Was this fair? Should our man have been given the decision? People read about the fight, and on the whole they don't like what they read, particularly about the condition of the two men. This wasn't in accord with Victorian ideas of decorum, that a man's face should be pounded to a pulp as Heenan's was, and that the fight should end in such chaos, the police really unable to gain control, the crowd fighting amongst each other, it didn't seem in keeping with the spirit of the age. So oddly enough, this fight, which seems to re-establish the prize ring at the centre of national sporting consciousness, in fact is the swan song of the prize ring. And while there are bare-knuckle prize ring fights after this, they're of nothing like the public interest that the Sayers-Heenan fight is, and it's often considered to be the last bare-knuckle prize fight in England. It wasn't. There were others after that, but none of them captured the public imagination in anything like the same way. The prize ring was now in terminal decline. After the Sayers-Heenan fight, Tom Sayers never fought again. A subscription was got up for him, to which many of the highest in the land contributed, Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister included. £3,000 it amounted to, a huge sum in the day. It was invested for Tom Sayers on condition that he never fought again. He was a great national hero. Everybody thought he'd done enough. He shouldn't fight again. And he didn't. But he gradually went downhill. He drank too much. He contracted diabetes, tuberculosis, and before he was 40 years old, he was dead. What finally killed him was TB, but the diabetes and the drinking didn't help. He died in 1865. He wasn't young for his age. To die in your late 30s was quite normal in London at the time.
Across the Atlantic, Jack Heenan fared little better.
His opponent, John Carmel Heenan, well, he lived to be the same age. He died some years later than Tom Sayers, but then again, he was some years younger. He too contracted tuberculosis, died of tuberculosis. He was, he enjoyed mixed success after fighting Tom Sayers. He had one more fight, which oddly enough was in England again. He lost it, said he may have been drugged, nobody quite knows. Went back to America, lived a somewhat chaotic life, but had some success with a gambling saloon. He was diagnosed with TB, went west for purer air, died on his way west, was taken back by Jim Cusick, his old manager, to New York, and was buried in upstate New York. And so he, like Tom Sayers, didn't make 40.
Tom Sayers' funeral procession to his final resting place at Highgate Cemetery was the last great show of the prize ring. It said 100,000 people lined the route. It was the passing of an era.
The Sayers-Heenan fight was one of the two greatest events in English sporting history. There was the World Cup final of 1966. A century earlier, 1860, there was Tom Sayers and John Heenan. No other event in English sporting history has captured the public imagination like it, apart from the 1966 World Cup final. So it's sad that their names should be forgotten today.
The Bare-Knuckle prize ring was never the same again. Very soon afterwards came far-reaching changes.
It's still in the 1860s, so a few years after the Sayers-Heenan fight, that the Queensberry rules come out. It's the Marquis of Queensberry whose name is attached to them, although he wasn't the main mover, but he patronised these rules. And the rules, of course, amongst other things, they provided for fixed-length rounds and for gloved fighting. And this was rather more acceptable. More decorum was involved. Fights were less chaotic. And gradually, as the years passed, the Queensberry rules began to replace the old bare-knuckle London prize ring rules. And by the turn of the 20th century, so it took a generation and more, but by the turn of the 20th century, the old London prize ring, the bare-knuckle prize ring, is essentially dead. You get some gypsy fighters, for example, but the old bare-knuckle prize ring is dead. It's been replaced by Queensberry rules fighting. Gloved fighting with fixed-length rounds, fixed-length contests, and much less chaos.
The Queensberry rules laid the foundations for modern boxing, and bare-knuckle fighting disappeared underground. Yet some echoes still remain of the noble spirit of the prize ring.
Is a fighter born? Yeah, depending on the circumstances that brings him over the brink where he or she has to fight. Yeah, we're all born with it in us. It's how you use it.
Only a fighter knows what goes through the mind before a fight. The preparations, the rituals to mask the fear. Fear of these last moments of uncertainty before it's time to face the crowd. It's 1826 in Georgian, England, and the fight is on. Now new investigation is revealing the world of the duelists who fought to the death with pistols on the field of honour.
A large number of dueling stories, for better or worse, involve drink.
They fought to clear their names, to settle a dispute, or simply to say they were right. And many were dead before breakfast.
Most of the shots fired during a pistol duel will hit you in the head, neck, or torso or upper limb.
Throughout history, men and women have faced one another in personal combat. At close quarters, one-on-one, face-to-face. They fought for honour, to settle bitter disputes, for prowess, to prove courage and skill, and for sport, to win glory and respect. From the pageantry of the medieval tournament ground, through the deadly rituals of duelists on the field of honour, to the savage backstreet arena of the Bare-Knuckle prize ring. It's these worlds that Fight Club explores. From 1714 to the 1830s, the Georgian period brought bloodshed on a scale never before seen. Across the world, British soldiers and sailors fought wars from North America to India. In Europe, they fought almost constantly, including nearly 25 years of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. These were violent times, and not just around the world. At home in England too, men and some women fought to the death to settle their differences. The image of two men marshalling their courage to face one another in a duel of honour captivates the imagination. Over the years, many artists, novelists and filmmakers have used the duel as the ultimate form of civilised confrontation. Yet this romanticised view is a long way from the bloody truth.
Most people are not trained to kill. It's a very foreign feeling to most people, a very foreign procedure. To kill is unnatural. I think if you're looking at life 200 years ago, when nearly 10% of injuries were caused by farm animals and accidents, these men were inured to difficulty, but not many were inured to kill. And I'm sure that training in discipline in the armed services prepared you very well for this. That's why there'd be a big difference between somebody in a duel who was a good infantry officer and a civilian who'd had no training at all.
Throughout Georgian times in Britain, dueling claimed many hundreds and probably thousands of lives. From 1785 to the end of the Georgian period in the 1830s, there were at least 1,000 known duels. It's likely that many more were fought unknown, in secret. Author and historian Richard Hopton has researched the rise and development of dueling in Britain, through to its zenith in the Georgian period.
I'd always been fascinated by the fact that people would resolve arguments by shooting at each other or fighting with swords, rather than, as people do now, by apologising or by resort to law. Dueling evolved out of the medieval practices of jousting and trial by combat.
In Britain, in the late 18th and early 19th century, the most common form of dueling was fighting with pistols. Yet this hadn't always been the case. Dueling had first spread to England from Europe in the 16th century, and the preferred weapon of that age was the sword. Fighting with swords was potentially lethal, but it required a degree of skill, or at the very least, some training and experience. Yet there were new weapons on the way, and they were made possible by the great leveller, gunpowder. Through the 17th century, firearms technology rapidly improved, and the pistol gradually began to replace the sword as the weapon of choice for dueling. Gone were the months and even years required to master the art of the sword.
The change from dueling with swords to dueling with pistols really came about as a result of changes in dress, because gentlemen stopped wearing swords as a piece of everyday dress from about the middle of the 18th century onwards. So whilst the change in dueling weapons didn't happen overnight, it would be fair to say, I think, that before 1740, the vast majority of duels were fought with swords, whereas after, say, 1760, the vast majority of duels were fought with pistols, and it's from about 1760 that the art of making dueling pistols really took off.
Short-barreled pistols were the first personal handguns. Easier to use than the heavy long-arm musket, they were also easier to conceal and transport, which made them ideal for dueling.
Many holster pistols, of course, were military. They were, as the name would imply, held in as a pair in a pistol holster set over the horse's body, and you would have two to give you two shots, and you would draw one, and the sort of doctrine was to ride up to the enemy, point it right at his face or his chest and pull the trigger, because otherwise you'd probably miss.
By the late 17th and early 18th century, the dominant form of pistol in Britain was the flintlock.
The flintlock pistol was a personal sidearm, and this is the sort of thing that an officer or a gentleman would carry, but there'd be a pair of them, be a matched pair. This is a typical pistol of the period. It's got slightly slab-sided, so it could have been a dueling pistol. The ignition system is the simple flintlock system, non-rainproof pan, so it's quite an early one. And it's a very fast action as well. And it's got sights on as well, so that makes it more likely to be a target stroke dueling pistol.
The weapon was fired by a flint, striking sparks against a steel frizzen and down into a pan of gunpowder. They could be unreliable and slow to load, but just as deadly as a modern firearm when discharged. Like all flintlocks, dueling pistols were handmade by skilled craftsmen. They could be extremely expensive, desirable objects that were valued as status symbols.
Throughout history, they've been used as a vehicle for artists to express themselves on, and rich patrons have employed the finest artists of the period to actually carry out art on them, engraving, inlay work, the carving on them, particularly the Continentals. The English, much more reserved, very, very fine, very delicate engraving. The Continental stuff was a big example of art being expressed on an object. Whether they were ever used or not is irrelevant. They were an expression of the wealth of the person.
Jonathan Ferguson is curator of firearms at the Royal Armouries in Leeds, UK. Based in the National Firearms Centre, he's carried out research into the Royal Armouries' extensive number of pistols from the 18th and 19th centuries. Yet even in a collection like this, identifying pistols that were made exclusively for dueling is extremely difficult. The Royal Armouries collection includes different variants of weapons, which show the evolution of the dueling pistol through the Georgian period.
We have around 26,000 firearms in total in the Royal Armouries collection. Even in a collection of that size, we don't have that many dueling pistols, as sort of evidenced by the way that we look at them today and the way collectors treat them and wish to collect them and look after them. They are sort of almost fetishized as symbols of the duel, of male courage, pride, and also the craftsmanship and skill that it took to make them and the cost of producing them. So this is the state of play, if you like, coming into sort of 1770. This already has some early features that would assist the duelist if he were to fight a duel with one of these. And as the first recorded pistol duel is something like 1711, this is a dueling pistol in that sense. Could have been used as such. So we have in there a gold pan and a gold touch hole to resist corrosion but also look pretty. We have a very slick flintlock mechanism. The next stage, if you like, if you can view this as a linear evolution, and of course features did overlap, is this kind of thing. Circa 1770, you could call this a transitional type between the holster pistol and the true dueling pistol. Crucially, they started to flatten off the sides of the stock where it's gripped, what we'd call the grip today, which gives a much more secure grip and reduces the lateral drift of the muzzle, if you like, particularly if you're nervous, as you might be if you're putting your life on the line. You see, this is rather more utilitarian in a way. It's lacking the gold or platinum decoration, but it's a beautifully made weapon, and it does, as they say, come up very quickly and smartly and well, and it points as an extension of your arm. You'd probably need a stopwatch to actually time how well a skilled man could bring this onto target. Just bring it up, and the sight picture is right there. You don't have to align it manually. It's just there. This example has sights. They don't always. Some just have a front sight for a quick index. It was actually thought of as bad form to take deliberate aim at your enemy, to even practice beforehand. There are accounts of people being caught practicing before a duel. So you were expected, in a space of 3 seconds was typical, to do what, as I've explained, to bring the thing up very quickly, take your shot, and you know, the devil take the hindmost kind of thing. And this is how we'd expect to encounter a set of dueling pistols on the dueling field, cased. By 1775 or thereabouts, we're seeing some consistent features. The flattened grip panels, almost an afterthought here, and in some cases there is no butt cap. This one has a little silver one there. This is what's called a roller bearing, just like a ball bearing, but it's cylindrical, and it acts on this piece here, which is the steel, or the frizzen in later parlance. And if I close that, and we imagine this firing, and I just throw this open gently with my thumb, it doesn't take that much pressure, and then it flies open. And that just increases the speed of ignition. It allows the sparks struck from this steel to more efficiently communicate that charge, that fire, to the little priming charge that's poured into the pan here ahead of time.
The greatest advancement in firearms technology during the Georgian period was the move from flintlock to percussion ignition.
So here we are with the famous name Manton. You can see right away, just like a modern revolver or other pistol, this grip here is now checkered. There are little remnants of the nice walnut. They wanted to leave those there, clearly. Those also disappear over time. So in essence, this pistol is sort of 1780, something like that. No pommel, no butt cap here at all. It's also something that certainly becomes increasingly popular into the beginning of the 19th century, the early 1800s, is this idea of a half stock. The wood is cut away. And that's partly fashion, but it's partly to accommodate what are now quite heavy barrels. We've gone away from the very quick pistol like the Wogdens to a very thick-walled barrel. And it's octagonal all the way down, as they all are by this stage, pretty much. And in there is Manton's name and his base of operations, London. Many of the famous makers, of course, operating in London. Now, where this is a little bit of a red herring in a way is, as you can see there, this is a percussion hammer that's been fitted here.
The percussion is much more like a modern pistol. It's virtually instantaneous. And I'll do the same demonstration. Bring it to half cock. Percussion cap. Fits on there. The cap is sat onto an anvil, a nipple. When the hammer strikes it, the fulminate of mercury ignites the main charge very, very quickly, and there shouldn't be any delay between that being hit and the smoke comes out the end. Powder at the end, the smoke at the end, almost instantaneously. Much faster ignition system, much more deadly.
Ivan Williams is an artist and designer. Throughout his career, he's combined his skills in fine arts, such as painting and sculpture, with an understanding of practical engineering. This balance of form and function finds its way into his work in commercial design, everything from school furniture to military weapons. Ivan has over half a century's experience in handling firearms, and he has a passion for restoring and shooting period weapons, including dueling pistols.
The thing about these pistols and purpose-made dueling pistols is they point beautifully. I mean, I hold that, it's come up to it, I grip it, if I put my arm out straight to the side, that's dead in line with my eyes. I don't really need to use the sights, and there is only one foresight on there. So in a duel where you need to shoot quickly, it is virtually like pointing your finger.
Richard Hopton has spent years studying dueling in Britain, yet he's never at first hand seen Georgian firearms used. He's joined Ivan Williams for a series of practical range tests to see for himself just how effective they can be in the right hands. Ivan is using original pistols, exactly the type that could have been used to fight duels 2 centuries ago. He's using live ammunition, black powder and a spherical lead bullet almost half an inch in diameter, capable of inflicting hideous wounds on the human body. First, they try the flintlock.
So powder charge, patch, ball, half cock.
And this is the important bit where you're filling up the pan with powder, and this is what will spark against the flint.
It's not easy. The black powder in the exposed pan can easily become damp, making it liable to misfire or not ignite at all.
Well, that must be, the original nightmare. Your gun misfires, you can't reload, and you've just got to wait for the fellow 12 yards away to fire at you. It's quite a big flash, and it's only at your arm's length that this is happening, and then there is a delay between the flash in the pan and the main charge in the breech of the gun going off, which, if you weren't used to it, could be very off-putting, I would think.
Next, Ivan tries the system which superseded the flintlock, the percussion system.
The percussion cap system was much less chancy and worked better,
yes.
Certainly in wet weather.
Yes, because the cap fitted over the nipple and was pretty well weatherproof. You could still absorb moisture.
Yeah.
And not until it was struck did it ignite. so it was very safe as well.
The percussion system is much more reliable and results in far fewer misfires than the flintlock. A duelist armed with this weapon could be sure his pistol would fire. All he had to do was somehow keep it on target.
With the percussion cap, there is no real delay. The trigger is squeezed and the weapon fires almost instantaneously. I think you got the heart that time, didn't you?
Yes, yes.
I'm very glad I've never fallen out with you, Ivan, over a game of cards or a woman. Right, let's go and have a look at the target, shall we, Ivan?
Yeah.
This is quite a chilling example of, in fact, how accurate these weapons were.
Oh, they were dead accurate. Absolutely dead accurate. If I stand against that target, look at the sort of sideways on, quite a few of those bullets would have been, well, in the neck and heart and lungs.
So, how then do you account for the apparently very large number of duels in which the duelists failed to hit their target at relatively close ranges such as this?
You'd be scared stiff. To have someone thinking someone else was trying to do the same to me, you want to get a shot off quickly, good chance of missing completely.
So it was largely human error rather than some defect in the gun.
So you need to be a very particular type of person that could stand there with that much confidence that you're going to win and that the nerves didn't take over.
Former surgeon Mick Crumplin is an expert on the medical practices of the Georgian period. He's researched the work of medical officers in the Napoleonic Wars, such as George James Guthrie and Sir Charles Bell, and he knows more than most people the effects of black powder firearms.
Well, obviously in a pistol duel, the opponent's very near to you, and therefore the kinetic energy imparted from the black powder discharge and the heavy round ball is going to be pretty high, putting a lot of energy into the body, and then of course it'll tail off as the weight of the ball slows everything down, and it's in a very inefficient shape, unlike modern high velocity rounds which are jacketed and impart huge amounts of energy. But these balls at close range cause very unpleasant injuries. A small entry wound and a lot of disruption as the track of the ball goes through, and if it hits any object, when you're very close to your opponent, it'll even knock pieces of bone out of the back of you, and it'll force bits of clothing into the wound, which often are in a pretty disgusting state and absolutely florid with bacterial growth, and so huge risk of infection. And obviously it depends where the ball hits you. If it hits you on a fleshy muscle part of your limb, you will be likely to survive with surgery and time, even if infection supervenes. But on the other hand, if you get a ball in the eye or in the jaw or in the neck, it can hit vital structures and cause hemorrhage or paralysis or blindness. And of course in the brain it'll cause fatality almost certainly.
In an era when bacterial infection was not fully understood, some duelists thought that wearing a silk shirt would help protect them if hit. Some even stripped their underwear before a fight.
In the armed services, where, obviously small arms fire was constantly destructive and accounted for about 2/3 of most injured men presenting to a surgeon, there are not a few stories of people reducing their clothing or wearing silk clothing in the belief that it protected you in some way, but this was utter rubbish. And in fact, in the Navy particularly, men were always advised to change their underwear and their stockings before battle, because clean clothing would be less likely to cause contamination if it was driven into your body.
Alcoholism was rife in Georgian times. Gentry and commoners alike drank large amounts of strong liquor, and many a duel was fought because of a drunken argument.
Georgian gentlemen drank very heavily. They drank lots of port and wine and so on, Heavy gambling was also a characteristic feature of the Georgian gentlemen, so huge sums of money were wagered, won and lost, and that also presumably shortened tempers and made people more prone to make accusations, which would then lead to a challenge and then to a duel. A large number of dueling stories, for better or worse, involve drink.
The point about alcohol is that it makes you bold as a lion. It's an anxiolytic drug. It reduces your anxiety and fear and gives you more courage, but it's not a painkiller, and it actually decreases performance, and that's why it's dangerous to drink and drive, because your reaction time is slower, and therefore in individual combat you will be less efficient by far if you're under the influence of alcohol.
Many duels were fought early in the morning, after one or both parties had been heavily drinking. After just a few hours, the alcohol would still be at work, and the effects could prove fatal for a duelist.
So here we have a combat between two individuals, and it would very much depend on their alcohol status, whether they had a lot the night before and were still overhung from that, because that will slow down performance. You will obviously find much more efficiency in a man who's been trained in action, who doesn't get in a panic, who hasn't got adrenaline and steroids running through his veins as he points the pistol at somebody else. He may shake. And, you know, with a delay of the flint going off, if he's not used to combat, he may well miss the target, because the kinetic energy is great at short range, but the accuracy is not very good, and so frequently people missed. And most of the shots fired during a pistol duel will hit you in the head, neck, or torso or upper limb, because that's where they're going to be aimed. So I think it very much depends on the two combatants. If they're both professional soldiers and free of alcohol effects, they will be extraordinarily lethal to each other. Whereas if one is feeling the effect of the night before, he will be more nervous, less accurate, and less efficient in his dueling and ability to survive.
Dueling was illegal, so duelists would go for remote or secluded areas to fight their private meetings. Around London in Georgian times, this meant extensive heaths and parks, like Putney Heath and Wimbledon Common, south of the River Thames.
This was undrained, low-lying, low-quality agricultural land, which just happened to be very close to central London and the seat of government. So it was across the river, but more bridges existed then than had done previously. So it was one of the nearest points at which people could relatively safely fight duels, safe from the point of view of discovery or prevention. There were only a small handful of cases in Georgian England where a duelist was convicted of murder by a jury, and they all involved, I think I'm right in saying, instances of foul play at the duel itself. There was a case in Ireland where one duelist simply shot his opponent in the back while the preparations for the duel were still underway, and the jury convicted him of murder and he was hanged. And there were one or two other cases where the duel happened too close to the argument, where seconds weren't involved, quite often where the parties were both drunk. But these were more akin to fights, really, than duels, and so not surprisingly, the juries convicted. But by and large, even where a duelist killed or injured his opponent in a duel, juries were very reluctant indeed to convict. The overall percentage of duelists who ended up in trouble with the law was very small, although some people did feel the need to take themselves temporarily in exile to the continent afterwards to let the brouhaha die down, but that's not quite the same thing. Certainly duelists might lie low afterwards, and publicity was not considered a good thing, which is why so many duels were fought in secret in the early morning in places like Battersea Park, away from the public gaze.
At its height in Georgian times, even Britain's ruling classes found themselves involved in dueling.
Dueling was really confined to a self-defining upper class. It was considered to be something that gentlemen, however that was defined, did. As they used to say, butchers' boys settled their arguments with meaty fists, and and certainly you wouldn't, as a gentleman, you wouldn't consider in those days fighting a duel with someone you considered to be your social inferior. You'd give them a good hiding with a whip, if you felt like it. Gentlemen duel against gentlemen, and that was the end of it. What underlines the whole ethos of dueling, whether here or in France or in Germany or in South America or in all places at all times, is the idea of the gentleman's honour. It was that forced people to seek redress on the dueling grounds. It was purely the concept of the gentleman's honour, and that was the only way to redress a slight to it.
Politicians, always conscious of their public image, were more open than most to falling into public disagreements. It seems amazing to us now, yet serving British MPs, ministers, and even some prime ministers fought duels. On the 27th of May 1798, at the height of the war between Britain and revolutionary France, Prime Minister William Pitt fought a duel on Putney Common. His opponent was George Tierney, another MP, and it was over a disagreement as to how the war should be fought. Both parties fired and missed, and Pitt resumed office as Prime Minister. Yet King George III was far from happy that he'd nearly lost the head of his government during wartime to a duel.
This is the letter that King George III sent to William Pitt after he, Pitt, had fought his duel as Prime Minister. We shouldn't forget that this was fought, the duel was fought while this country was at war with France. And the king was not very amused by Pitt's activities. And he wrote, very tersely, "Perhaps the duel, could not have been avoided, but it is a sufficient reason to prevent its ever being again necessary." And the king continues, "Public characters have no right to weigh alone what they owe to themselves. They must consider also what is due to their country," which leaves very little doubt as to what King George thought of Pitt putting himself at risk in that fashion.
A few years later, again during wartime, two ministers serving in the same cabinet fought a duel. Secretary for War Viscount Castlereagh and Foreign Secretary George Canning fought on Putney Heath in September 1809.
Well, in the case of Canning and Castlereagh, they both resigned from the cabinet in order to do it. I suppose the fact that they were able to continue in office, having committed what was in effect a criminal offence, and Canning was wounded, is proof, to my way of thinking, of the social acceptability of duelling. I mean, it was what was expected of you.
The most famous of all duelling British politicians fought his encounter on the 21st of March 1829. The Duke of Wellington, hero of the Peninsular War and Waterloo, was the serving Prime Minister. In his time as Commander of the Army, he had strictly forbidden duelling among his officers. Yet he himself found it impossible to avoid the social pressure of fighting a duel. His opponent was the outspoken Earl Winchelsea, who'd criticised Wellington's opinions on Catholic emancipation.
The contrast between modern Battersea Park and what this part of London would have been like in 1829 is extraordinary, because we have the chimneys and the looming shell of what remains of Battersea Power Station, and the Victorian bandstand and the tennis courts and the joggers and the people walking their dogs. And in 1829 it was low-lying, marshy agricultural land, very far from the plane tree shaded park that it is nowadays. And it's odd to think of a serving Prime Minister, say the David Cameron of his day, trotting out from Westminster on a horse, quite deliberately to shoot at a political opponent. Politicians no longer have anything even approaching the old-fashioned sense of honour. They accuse each other of lying the whole time as a matter of course. They have no sense of public honour at all, and very little sense of shame either, but that's another issue. A small cavalcade came trotting over the bridge and into what is now Battersea Park. And one of the first things they saw when they got here early that morning, they saw an agricultural labourer whetting his scythe, presumably ready to cut the hay or cut the grass in some shape or form. And there were 5 people. There was the Duke of Wellington and his second, who was called Sir Henry Harding, and Winchelsea and his second, who was a man called Lord Falmouth. The 5th member of this cavalcade was a doctor. It was quite common practice to bring doctors to duels in those days for very obvious reasons. But in this particular occasion, the doctor had another and rather unusual function to fulfill. Because Henry Harding, Wellington's second, had lost his left hand at the Battle of Waterloo, he was unable to fulfill one of the second's most important duties, which was to load his principal's gun. And normally this was done by the 2 seconds supervising each other, and then they would hand the loaded pistols to their principals, and then the distance would be marked out and the duel would then happen. But in this instance, Harding having only one hand, he was unable to load the Duke's pistol for him. So the doctor was drafted in to perform this duty, which one might think was a slightly curious thing for the doctor at a duel to be doing. Once the Duke and Winchelsea had arrived on the dueling ground, seconds would then have agreed the distance over which it was to be fought, and would most importantly have measured out the distance. They would have been told what signal would be given for fire, and they would then have retired to their respective marks, and then one or other of the seconds shouted fire, or sometimes a handkerchief would be dropped. So it must have been a really frightening prospect, even for someone like Wellington, who had fought in any number of battles from Waterloo and all through the peninsula and in India and so on. And Winchelsea, I don't think, had seen much active service. It must have been really frightening. Once the command to fire was given by one of the seconds, Wellington noticed that Winchelsea was standing with his pistol down by his side, and slowly he raised it and discharged it into the air, because he decided that he couldn't possibly risk shooting at the Prime Minister, the hero of Waterloo. And at that point, Wellington himself discharged his pistol into the air. So now the duel had happened, honour was satisfied, and an apology was drafted by the seconds, which both Wellington and Winchelsea signed. Wellington tipped his hat to Winchelsea, said, "Good morning, sir," mounted his horse and trotted off. And apparently when he got home, his then mistress, Mrs. Arbuthnot, was having breakfast, and he walked in and said something like, "My dear, what would you think if you heard that a gentleman had been on the dueling ground this morning?" And she said something like, "Oh, I'd be frightfully impressed."
After Wellington, no other British Prime Ministers fought duels. Yet even into the 1840s and beyond, some aristocrats behaved as though it was still the heady days of the Regency, when duelling was at its height. One of the last recorded duels was fought on Wimbledon Common, and it was one of the most talked about ever. Its provoker was one of the most controversial characters of the whole Victorian period.
It's here on Wimbledon Common that Lord Cardigan in September 1840 fought his celebrated duel against Captain Tuckett. Cardigan and Tuckett had fallen out over various things to do in Cardigan's regiment, the 11th Hussars, and Tuckett published an anonymous but defamatory article about Cardigan in the press, and Cardigan had a fairly shrewd idea who was responsible. He demanded an apology and then challenged him to a duel. So it was on the 12th of September 1840 that Cardigan and Captain Tuckett came here to fight their duel near the famous windmill. Tuckett was wounded, and the miller, one Thomas Dan, who also doubled as the local constable, saw Cardigan classically with the smoking pistol in his hand and ran down from the windmill to make an arrest. And that's how the matter ended up in the law courts, as it did 3 or 4 months later. The Cardigan duel was not the last duel in England, but certainly the last notorious duel, because Cardigan, being a peer, exercised his right to be tried for the wounding of Captain Tuckett by his peers. So there was a great set-piece trial in the House of Lords in February 1841, which attracted huge attention. Tickets for seats in the chamber were sold, and the press whipped up a huge amount of enthusiasm about it. And Cardigan was acquitted on a gross technicality, which led to an enormous amount of anger and frustration in the newspapers, because Cardigan was not a popular man. He was very wealthy and sort of rather behaved like a Regency buck 30 years too late.
Lord Cardigan would, 15 years later, lead the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. Never popular with his soldiers, nor with the public, Cardigan was notoriously arrogant and quarrelsome. Just a few years after Cardigan's duel, the Queen's regulations were changed to stamp out dueling among officers in the army. With that, dueling gradually fell away.
By the end of the 19th century, dueling was absolutely dead in England, and there are one or two well-known cases, the best known of which is called the Tranby-Croft affair, which was 1891, I think, when exactly the same sort of people who, a generation or two earlier, would have been fighting a duel over an accusation of cheating at cards, ending up suing each other for defamation. You know, they were rich, they were army officers, exactly the types who would have been fighting duels, 40 years before. And they ended up in the law courts in the 1890s. The possibility of seeking redress through the courts, either in the law of defamation or however else, became more socially acceptable and a better remedy.
As the 19th century moved on into the reign of Queen Victoria, standards changed, and dueling was no longer viewed as an acceptable way of settling disputes. Yet things turned full circle when the art of dueling could be tried out without risk of a fatal bullet wound.
The ultimate expression of this reduction in tolerance for violence and in the reduced casualty rate that you get with firearms, perversely, is this piece here that we have in front of us. The pistols are quite real, but it's designed to fire little compressed wax bullets. These are for simulating a duel or simply for fun, for sport. These are a mixture of charcoal powder and wax. They're very light. They could potentially be lethal if they hit you in the wrong place, but you were intended to wear a very thick, full-length coat and a sort of Edwardian paintball mask, if you like, to protect your eyes and face. And apart from some boxes of ammunition that you can see here, bullet mold, cleaning tools, most interestingly of all is this heart-shaped steel guard. And we're then ready to aim and fire with our hand protected thoroughly by this substantial piece of steel. They are breech loading. This is the 20th century after all. This lever on the side here opens the breech, and a little extractor removes one of these, which is essentially like the rim of a cartridge to hold the primer. That's the propellant. No more loading it from the muzzle, pushes the wax bullet out of the front of the gun. So this on its own could potentially be lethal, but it's the bullet that makes it a game.
With the end of the 1850s, pistol dueling in Britain had almost completely disappeared. It represented a bygone era, kept alive only in the works of painters, novelists and dramatists.
I suppose on the face of it, it's romantic. In practice, I suspect it was very unromantic, terrifying. There's something very sort of cold and clinical and calculating about having an argument and then challenging someone to a duel, then the seconds trying to resolve it, and then when they can't resolve it, deciding on which weapons to be used, where they should meet, the time of day and all that sort of thing. And then the duelist getting into his carriage and going there, having spent the night very often writing letters to his nearest and dearest and settling his affairs, thinking that he might be dead by breakfast time.
Only a fighter knows what goes through the mind before a fight. The preparations, the rituals to mask the fear. Fear of these last moments of uncertainty before it's time to face the crowd. It's the late 1400s in Tudor England, and the fight is on.
A knight is born and bred to fight.
Today, new research is uncovering the world of the medieval tournament and the fury of the combat on foot. Exploring how the Tudor knight fought for money and renown among his peers. Shedding light on a time when war and sport were one and the same, and the honour of a knight depended on his skill with weapons in the ultimate martial art of the Middle Ages.
A knight is taking on superhuman ability.
The disfigurement and scars were terrible, and obviously a sign of great experience.
They are wearing their armours and weapons of war, and they're dying just as in battle.
Throughout history, men and women have faced one another in personal combat. At close quarters, one-on-one, face-to-face. They fought for honour, to settle bitter disputes, for prowess, to prove courage and skill, and for sport, to win glory and respect. From the pageantry of the medieval tournament ground, through the deadly rituals of duelists on the field of honour, to the savage backstreet arena of the Bare-Knuckle prize ring. It's these worlds that Fight Club explores. The Tudor period in England began with Henry Tudor's bloody victory at Stoke Field in 1487. It brought to a close decades of terrible civil war, known as the Wars of the Roses, and the new king was crowned Henry VII. The tourney, or tournament, was the ultimate martial arts competition throughout the medieval period. It was confined to the upper levels of society, the knights. Only wealthy aristocrats could afford the vastly expensive armour, weapons, and retainers needed to take part.
A knight has huge cultural importance. He's not just a warrior, he's a lord, he's a leader of men, he's a symbol. He's a heroic symbol.
Karen Watts is Senior Curator of European Armour at the Royal Armouries in Leeds. She's one of the country's leading experts on the study and conservation of armour throughout history. But it's the iconic medieval knight that sparked her interest right from the start.
I grew up reading an awful lot of accounts of chivalrous deeds as a child. And I was taken to the Tower of London, and there they were, these knights, actually, as though they'd stepped out of the pages of, of all of these great chivalric romances of an Arthurian legend. And so I connected with it. They were actually men from the past right here in the present with me.
Originally based at the Tower of London, the Royal Armouries is Britain's oldest museum and is among the oldest anywhere in the world. It houses the UK's national collection of arms and armour, one of the largest in existence, with more than 70,000 items.
Well, the amazing thing about armour is that it is material culture. It's so much better than just simple written archives that are descriptive and will give you a certain amount of information. The objects talk, and the whole thing that I am aiming to do is to get those objects to speak to me. and they've travelled from the past, they've had a history. And then aside from that, there's all the great artistry of the object. It's displaying the skills of those craftsmen in the past that we can visibly see and study now. So it's sculpture in steel as well as being a piece of bodily protection. It's completely functional.
Ivan Williams is a sculptor and artist. He's been studying arms and armour for most of his life, and he's fascinated by the skill and craftsmanship of the people hundreds of years ago who produced them. It's an almost completely forgotten art.
As a designer and artist, the most inspiring thing in life, you realise, is nature. Everything around you is so much greater than anything we can ever make ourselves. Animals evolve to be certain things in certain environments, to defend themselves, to be able to move, fly, swim, whatever. Armour evolved to protect people. It's just like growing a carapace over yourself, and it's made by another craftsman to fit you. It's tailor-made. It has to function. It has to be also strong enough to stop penetration of sharp and pointed weapons. And at the same time, follow the fashion of the day.
Ivan Williams has come to the Royal Armouries to meet with Karen and find out more about the way armour was made and see for himself some of the most important surviving pieces in the world.
And here we are in store one.
The Royal Armoury stores houses just some of the vast collection.
You have to remember that the Armouries isn't just a royal armoury collection, but it's also an arsenal.
Yes.
So it's here that we have the repository of the armour and equipment for all the royal soldiers. So we have many, many rows and types of the same thing.
It's where the armour can be studied and conserved.
As a sculptor working in stone and metal, whatever, I've just been so fascinated by armour and by its structure and the way it's been made. I want to know more about the making of it. I understand the protective qualities and the deflection, that sort of thing. So it's mobile working art to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're going to get killed, you've got to get killed in the height of fashion.
What does that say to you?
It's a piece of armour to protect somebody, but it's a status symbol. It says who you are, where you come from, how much money you've got, you know. Everything about it is so beautiful.
Absolutely. If you could afford to have your own armourer,
yeah,
you are at the very, very top.
I don't think anyone realises how hard it is to just do anything with a piece of steel.
Yeah, and of course there is a very close relationship between the patron, the man who's going to wear this, and his armourer. This has to fit perfectly like a second shell or a second skin. Yeah. But it isn't just him standing like this, wearing it, because that's the trouble we have with these. When I keep putting these on these wooden mannequins, they're all stiff. You get the impression that you're walking like this because you can't move, whereas in fact you can run in a suit of armour, you can leap onto your horse unaided, and all of this has to flex with the whole body.
Toby Capwell is the curator of arms and armour at the Wallace Collection in London. He's been immersed in the life of the medieval knight since learning to ride at the age of 11 and competing in his first joust at 19. Alongside his academic career, he competes in medieval tournaments in Europe and America, both jousting and in combat on foot. Over decades of careful research and practical experience, he's explored how a knight's armour worked as an integrated system.
The story of armor is as old as the story of warriors and goes back probably all the way to the Stone Age. But give us 4,000 or 5,000 years and we end up in the 15th century when the archetypal full plate armor had developed. And this is not a simple thing, covering the human body, which moves dynamically in many different ways with plates of hardened steel. And it took several hundred years to develop the perfect human exoskeleton, essentially. And you can study this in libraries and museums all you like, but after a certain point, to really understand it, you need to get inside.
There are no manuals or master armourers to consult. The only way to find out is to reproduce medieval armour to the most exacting standards possible, and then try and make it work on the body.
Well, getting a full plate armor on is quite an involved process, and it's not something you do in a hurry. I mean, if I really needed to, I could get this armor on in about 15-20 minutes. But really, I want to take my time. I want to make sure every single piece is precisely right. And if I'm taking my time, putting an armor on from head to foot takes about an hour. We always fixate on the metal bits, because that's the exciting part, the obvious part of an armor. But what's going on underneath is just as important. You know, the garments that you wear underneath the armor are absolutely crucial. And the doublet especially, the coat that I'm wearing is essentially a foundation garment. It's very closely fitted, it's got padding in all the right areas, and it also has attachment points for each of the pieces of armor. At the moment, the leg armor is going on, and there are attachment points at the base of the arming doublet to support the upper leg armor. And as you go up, everything has a place. So you haven't got all the individual elements of the armor sliding around all over the place. They click into place, they strap on, they tie on, and are kind of mutually supported. All knights would be aware of the culture of chivalry that surrounds them as a warrior class. And they'd all be aware of what was important, what was thought of as being important. Not only being a virtuoso fighter, but also being elegant, being graceful, having manners, and never, for example, showing that you're in pain. This is fine-tuned stuff. You have to have it tuned just perfectly. You can see here you've got around the knee, there's an articulated joint. And that articulated joint moves perfectly with my articulated joint. And if this plate is either slightly too high or slightly too low, the joint in the armor doesn't match up with the joint in Toby, and it stops working well. I start getting uncomfortable, I start getting upset, it stops working as well as it should, and the whole thing starts to fall apart.
Look at this turning joint. Isn't that cunning?
That is, I mean, and yet it doesn't look like a piece of tubing.
No.
To do that with a hammer or whatever tool they use.
And there's no gap here. Because you're trying to avoid the blade catching on anything. So it swivels perfectly, and the whole arm can fold in.
That's really nice. And I mean, when you bend that, see how that fits around that. At no point does it lock up. If you straighten that down, it'll still move, won't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
There you go.
Yeah. So that to actually sort of work out how much metal to sort of leave to do that rollover, because that goes right the way around and around the back from what I've seen of them, and it's really quite chunky metal. So to get that rollover, which tapers as well, I mean, it's a beautiful shape, it's even both sides, and then to put this rope form in, the actual line there is difficult enough without sort of trying to put it in with a chisel or whatever. And to get it on, it's a twin line as well. It's been cut in. It's absolutely beautiful everywhere. Nothing else but admiration. I just wish I knew how they did it.
The amount of time one spends in the armor depends on what one is doing. If it's a tournament, you might spend only an hour or two in it. At your part of the tournament, you put it on, you fight, you get off again. In a military campaign, you might be in the armor for days. You might and only have a chance perhaps at night to take your part of your body armor off, but if it's a tense situation, you don't know what's happening, you could have to spend days in this equipment. So it needs to fit. If you're spending serious amounts of time in it, any little irritation is going to be magnified exponentially. So if I've got a little bit of a lace that's just digging me in the back of the leg, I can put up with that for an hour to joust and then go home. But if I'm in this for a week on campaign, I'm going to be really upset by the end of the first day, and I'm going to be in agony by the next morning. So everything's got to be absolutely perfect. When we realize how carefully fitted the armor has to be in order to work as well as it possibly can, we rapidly realize that the armorer, this master craftsman, this sculptor in steel, is not just a metal worker. He's also a kind of biomechanic. He has to have an incredible, subtle understanding of the way the human body works. You know, because it is a very subtle and complex thing. It's not just as simple as where the shoulders flex and where the elbows bend. There's all kinds of subtle twisting and expanding and contracting of the joints and the muscles that he has to allow for in hardened steel, not the most forgiving of metals.
Look at the direction of overlap.
Yeah.
They're overlapping onto this central metatarsal plate.
All those flutes are all in line. Even when you flexed up, the flutes still slide over perfectly.
Gauntlets.
Right.
Now, I brought this one up because it is actually one of my favourites, although it's 15th century. This is remarkable.
Perfect.
And I only picked the tip up. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going.
Goodness me, that's oh, that curve around there. And it's elegant and delicate as well, isn't it?
Yes.
As well as being strong and armoured, it's so graceful.
The armor is also so complex that I couldn't possibly put it on by myself. And just as I have someone to help me get my armor on, he would then put his own armor on, and I would have a group of bodyguards around me. We would fight as a unit. Knights never go anywhere by themselves. You know, they have to be individually very skilled, but they also need to work as a team. This is sort of 500 years of evolution for how best to armor the human form. You know, the human form, the skeletal structure, works in a very particular way. But what is the best arrangement of plates, and how does that break down in terms of the proportion of the skeletal structure is a really interesting question. You know, it's a kind of roll cage in a way. And even if a high-powered weapon was to get through all of these layers of steel, it still has to travel a fair way through before it gets to me. Most weapons that hit me are just going to bounce off or slip off, or they're not going to grab me. And on the rare occasions that they do gain purchase, you know, there's 3 or 4 millimeters of steel they need to go through before they get to me, and they might then encounter a layer of mail, and then several layers of textile, and you know, by then, most of that energy is gone. When you start to put on an armor like this, and you realize what it can do, you very rapidly understand that a knight is taking on superhuman abilities. You know, he can survive terrible physical punishment that would kill an ordinary unprotected human being. And with the power of his horse, he certainly has strength and speed well beyond what an ordinary human has. The armor can be configured for either combat on horseback or combat on foot. So I tend to be a horseman most of the time. So let's go with that first. One of the most important pieces of equipment for a 15th century mounted knight was his so-called lance rest, although it does support the weight of the lance quite effectively. What it's really about is impact. When you lock your lance down onto this arm, it becomes much more secure, and when you hit someone, the force of the impact goes through your center of gravity rather than just through your grip. So with a lance rest, I suddenly can hit someone 3 or 4 times harder than I would be able to if I didn't have one. Fighting on horseback is a very asymmetrical activity. You've got your reins in one hand and you've got your weapons in the other hand. So, you know, the left and right side of your body are doing very different things. So that leads to inherent asymmetries in an armor heavily weighted towards fighting on horseback. You really need to wear the strongest visor available. And that, of course, takes down your ability to see and to breathe and to communicate. But the protection is really essential. Those are sacrifices I'm quite happy to make when people are hitting me in the head with lances.
Armour protects you completely, so why on earth did anybody ever get hurt or killed in battle? Henry II dies at a French tournament because he lifts his visor up to breathe. And of course he doesn't close it properly, and he gets a splinter full of lance shards into his eye and dies horribly 3 days later.
Do you think that'll fit me?
It might do. Put down.
Oh, great.
There we go. With a blade, I'm not going to be able to lift any of these plates up because you're fully protected. But you've still got vision holes here, vision slits, so that enables you to see properly.
Yeah.
And breathing holes on either side.
I can't see any of the metal now. I'm not aware of this grid because this grid is so close to my eyes. It's like a fencing mask. It actually accentuates my eyesight. I can see clearer. The other thing I'm surprised at is the peripheral vision. I can see right the way round. If I bring my hands round, I can now see my left hand, my right hand without moving my head inside. That's pretty good.
Which is impressive because you would be in battle formation with a team of knights next to you, so you can actually see your fellow knights, but you can also have the breadth of vision to see the knights coming towards you in a tourney or a mock battle, because you can actually encompass everybody coming towards you and then focus in on the one that you're going to charge at with your lance.
If I want to fight on foot with the poleaxe or the longsword, I need to wear the armor in a slightly different way. The beautiful thing about an armor like this is that it is really quite adaptable, and it can serve several different fighting functions. I don't need the same level of asymmetry in the equipment that I have on horseback. Fighting on foot is a much more symmetrical activity. I might be fighting with my right hand, I might be fighting with my left hand, I might be switching all the way through the battle, doing different things. So I need more symmetry in the armor. I also need more mobility and less weight on the upper body. I need to be able to jump around. My body is carrying all of this weight. I haven't got a horse to help me. So bringing the weight down, bringing the protection down to a certain extent, but raising the mobility becomes much more important on foot. So we can use the same helmet for foot combat, but to optimize my fighting ability, we're going to put a different visor on that is specially conceived for fighting on foot in particular. So it's giving much better visibility. It's covering the face in quite a different way. I can breathe much better in this helmet because I'm going to be breathing harder jumping around on foot.
Men change when they wear armour. There's something about the way that they suddenly will stand and hold themselves. There's certainly immense belief in their invincibility. You can't be a knight in armour unless you are immensely aggressive and have immense self-confidence, immense physical strength, and the knowledge of how to use that physical strength to its fullest capacity. They will have been trained from the age of 7 onwards in how to wear the armour and move in the armour, because you can do all movements in armour, but you do have to learn how to roll your shoulder round so that you don't lock your shoulder defence inside your breastplate. You have to learn that the breastplate is pressing against your chest, so you need to breathe deep in the diaphragm. You're overheating, so you have to learn how to take a number of controlled breaths all the time. You're in this steel shell that is, on the one hand, protecting you, but on the other hand is constricting you. They have to know how to overcome all that and believe and know precisely how they can move and fight.
With the armour working as an efficient system, it's time for the next stage. Torbay has to be able to fight in it.
The sword has many advantages. It's a powerful cutting weapon. But as soon as you have people clad entirely in hardened steel, cuts are no longer going to do anything. The sort of attacks that I would use if my opponent was unarmored or wearing minimal armor, cuts to the face, cuts to the body, are not really going to do anything against him at all. And a sword can be adapted for fighting in armor, but it has to be used in a very different way. Very often you read about what was called half-swording technique, where actually you're shortening a long sword like this and gaining much more close, very specific control of the point. And the reason to do this is so that you can get in the gaps of the armor, into the face, into the underarms, prizing between the plates rather than trying to pierce them themselves. You know, the center of a knight's armor, certainly in an Italian armor like this, is crossbow proof, it's longbow proof, and it's very frequently firearm proof. So you're not going to get the point of a sword through it. When you're considering the gaps that might present themselves in an opponent's armor, sometimes the armor responds in some quite interesting ways. For example, if I was going to try and get between the plates on Dom's chest and his neck, if I'm trying to go underneath there, I hit the stop rib that's been applied to the breastplate. They're expecting weapons to be sliding up, and they get caught on this applied plate under there. So at the last minute, the armor has saved him from a lethal thrust into his throat. Even if this stop rib were to fail, he's still got a couple layers of mail under there as a last-ditch attempt before I get to him.
There were different weapons used in the combat on foot. Swords, sometimes spears or javelins. The most fearsome form of combat in the tournaments involved the poleaxe, or more correctly, the poleaxe.
It's important to say something about the word itself. This is poleaxe, P-O-L-L-A-X-E or A-X, not pole. It's not a pole weapon, it's a pole weapon. It's a head axe. What that term actually means is probably somewhat debatable. It's been explained by saying, well, it's a weapon for cracking people's heads, but actually you do a lot of other things with it. It could be explained simply because it's a very long axe as opposed to a wood axe or something. It should be as high as your head, so maybe that's the derivation of the word. It's hard to say. And a lot of different heads can be integrated into a weapon like this. This one, for example, has an axe blade combined with a long, sharp fluke on the back, and of course the top spike. It's a strange kind of multi-tool in a way. Whereas another very common variant is to retain that long curved spike, but instead to have a hammer head, a crushing weapon on the other side. The axe blade, again, though more useful than a sword blade, is probably of limited value against a fully armed knight. So switching it round to the beak is probably, if you want to hurt someone, probably the thing to do. A lot of the best and most effective poleaxe fighting technique spends most of its time with the queue, or the tail of the axe. If I'm blocking a blow, I can then use the leverage of the axe to push my opponent over. If it's a tournament, push him out of the ring. If it's a battle, push him down on the ground.
The popularity of tournaments in Britain varied throughout the Middle Ages. In times of famine or plague, they were less common, and during wartime, it sometimes flourished. It often depended on the king. Under the warlike Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, tourney became extremely popular. The tournament was good training for war.
These are martial games, and the way that war is fought is with mounted knights on horseback with their lances couched under their arm, passed over their horse's neck, and you pass left side to left side. And it's a team. It became a team sport because war is lines of mounted knights charging against each other. Certain knights would gain in power and dominion through their reputation on the tournament field. William Marshall did that. He was a minor knight who became one of the most powerful men in England because he was successful on the tournament circuit. But right at the beginning, they are wearing their armours and weapons of war, and they're dying just as in battle. So they're banned and prohibited. There's a number of edicts that are led out by kings and popes banning tournaments. However, the French carry on fighting in the same way and having tournaments, and it's noted that they are actually braver in battle and more successful. So at this point, this is where we begin to see that tournaments began to be licensed under Richard I, for example, and rules and regulations are brought in of what equipment that you're going to wear, what weapons you're going to use. Gradually, they bring in more and more rules and more protective clothing, and that is to say protective armour. So they wear their armour for war, and then they start wearing reinforcers on top of it to give that extra added protection.
Former surgeon Mick Crumplin is an expert on medical techniques throughout history. He's researched the injuries inflicted by different types of historical combat.
I would love to have done a post-mortem on a lifetime soldier in medieval times. I think you would probably find a lot of healed broken bones of the arm and wrist and even the hands, and obviously injuries around the head and neck. If you're hit by a blade or anything on the face, there was no accurate suturing, so the disfigurement and scars were terrible, and obviously a sign of great experience. No doubt a spike would go through plate armour. It would, with sufficient force, I'm sure, but a lot of metal protection presumably dented, and you got enormous contusion injuries inside. And in the head that would be a problem, because although you can not have a skull fracture, you can inflict enormous damage on the soft jelly-like brain, because in normal consistency the brain is very soft, and if it gets shaken about and jarred, what we call contre-coup injury, in other words you get hit on one side and the brain rams against the other side of the skull, you get tremendous internal disruption on a microscopic level which impairs function.
There are certainly records of people getting broken bones, which I think is the most common, when plates and limbs can be prized apart on arms and legs, which is often the case. Then there are some very severe limb injuries are the most common.
The wound man is quite remarkable. It's unique in showing the various types of ghastly wounds that can be inflicted on both military and civil people. And it underpins the kind of basic teaching that surgeons had of the kind of wounds they had to treat, because obviously the effects of each type of wound were different on the sufferer. So you had contused wounds, which really means bruising and soft tissue damage, but the tissue surface remaining intact. Then you have lacerated wounds, where, for instance, a cannonball or a shot will pass through your tissues and leave bits hanging around, and it's torn into you. And then you have punctured wounds, which are inflicted by sharp pointed weapons, such as the long sword. And then you have the slashing wound, which inevitably mainly fall around the head and neck. So these are the four types of wounds that we're familiar with in combat.
In the early years of the 16th century, tournament fighting was on the wane. Yet the arrival of King Henry VIII in 1509 turned its fortunes around. Physically strong and athletic, Henry was the epitome of the fighting monarch. He trained in the knightly martial arts all his life and was himself a keen competitor at tournaments. Yet he also knew their usefulness politically, in cementing alliances and displaying prestige and power to would-be rivals in Europe. The era of medieval tourney reached its zenith under Henry VIII. In 1520, he staged the greatest ever known. For a few days, a quiet area of rural northern France was transformed.
Incredibly glorious, wonderful, spectacular tournaments were held all the time and had been from the 14th century through to the 16th century. We have a very interesting and tight diplomatic and political situation. You have got Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor, inheriting directly from his grandfather Maximilian. You have Francis I in France, and you have Henry VIII in England. Now, Henry VIII is married to Catherine of Aragon, who is Charles V's aunt. So he's already made that political link there. But you have these three powers who are looking closely at each other. And Henry is trying to form an alliance with France. So he holds this glorious tournament in carefully constructed neutral ground. So Henry VIII travels to the Pas-de-Calais, which is of course part of England and stays there. Francis I remains in France. And in their two towns of Ardres and Guines, between them is a neutral area. It's just fields. It's nothing but fields to begin with. Then they start dressing it. So a whole palace is built. It's got glass, it's got statues and sculptures all the way around it. There are wonderful tilt yards are made. A tree of honour is constructed, symbolically and politically entwining the two great trees symbolising England and France, on which were hung the shields for the combats.
Such was the opulence of the rich pavilions and banners that it became known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. It was far more than just a tournament. Henry was determined to impress. The tournament ground itself was the size of a small town. As well as the combat arenas, there were hundreds of tents and marquees, fully fitted with apartments and chambers for their royal residence, painted to look like they were made of stone. There were even silver fountains, which flowed with red and white wine.
An amazing amount of luxury was dispensed on just this incredible scene setting. And you think, well, this is all about play acting, this is all about pomp and diplomacy, wonderful parades and processions as each king enters every day, as the queens are there. They break off each Sunday for special masses, and it's all done with glorious pomp and circumstance. But the one thing you have to remember is that these two kings genuinely loved fighting. They had never met each other before. They were curious about each other. They were curious about each other's physicality.
Henry commissioned a special suit of armour in which to compete in the combat on foot. It can still be seen in the royal armouries today, complete with telltale mistakes in its decorations, brought about when the armour had to be modified to suit last-minute changes in tournament rules.
Henry VIII founds his royal workshop at Greenwich, and he has as his master armourer Martin van Rooyen. And Martin van Rooyen creates for Henry VIII a magnificent, fully articulating steel armour where every piece locks into every other. If you look at it, the helmet locks into the collar, that locks down into the thighs, that lock down into the feet. The arms are all locked place. This is an armour that doesn't have any chinks in it. No chinks in this armour whatsoever. It's a glorious fitting armour all the way around him. It's a magnificent feat. 3 months before the tournament, the French changed the rules. Now, they were entitled to do this, and they specified a different weapon. Now, this means that they're now going to use the big two-handed sword. They're not going to use the poleaxe. They don't need this fully articulated armour. This armour is almost ready. It's still black from the hammer, and the last piece is waiting to be put on it, which is the standing neck guard for the shoulder. And today we can just see the holes where it would have been. And they have to go in and they have to cancel it. And Martin van Rooyen has now got 3 months to come up with an armour with a skirt. Well, he couldn't make an armour from scratch in 3 months. So they had to look around for pieces that Henry already had and adapt it. So the great bassinet helmet, one of the most crucial elements, has got Italian armourer's marks on the back. So it has clearly been an Italian piece that the king already had, and it's been placed on him. You know, they've then created the fully symmetrical armour, symmetrical arm defences, leg defences, and this big skirt, which they've then decorated hurriedly. They start off very well and they run out of time to do the decoration. They have managed to put a Virgin and Child on one side of the helmet and on the shoulder, and a St. George and the Dragon on the other helmet and shoulder, and the collar of the Order of the Garter around the neck, Though they don't quite finish doing all the decoration at the back, but the front looks fine. And best of all, the garter itself is etched around the knee. So they've imitated that as well. So they have given the king Tudor and English symbolism, and particularly of the famous Order of the Garter, the great Order of Chivalry. So it is most definitely decorated, and he would have appreciated that it would have been decorated with all the emblems that described himself. Both kings would have fought each other, except that at the Field of Cloth of Gold it was carefully arranged that neither king would fight each other. They would fight knights from each other's court, because they would have gone for it for real. One king would have lost, and there'd been an immense loss of face. But both of them were competing for real, and both of them are paying very close attention to how the other is performing. And on one day, Henry VIII takes part in the archery, because longbow archery is regarded as an admirable skill for a man, not only just a yeoman of England, but also for a king. But for the French it isn't. So Francis I takes little or no part, and Henry VIII does very well. Buoyed by this wonderful élan of success, he then challenges Francis I to a wrestling match, which Francis agrees to instantly. And this shows how much the two of them actually want the combat, despite all of the diplomacy. And you can imagine all the courtiers going, no! So the two kings wrestle, and unfortunately, Henry VIII is quickly thrown by the French king, who is extremely good at this particular sport, and Henry slopes away in some anger. Nobody has ever asked me who won the Field of Cloth of Gold. It was deemed that many individual knights had done extremely well, particularly the kings. I mean, genuinely, those two kings did joust and fight extremely well. There's no doubt about it. It went down in history as the most magnificent tournament ever held.
The Great Spectacular marked the beginning of the end of the era of the medieval tourney. Tournaments continued after Henry's reign, even into the early 17th century, yet none was ever as memorable as the glittering Field of the Cloth of Gold.
This was because it came at the end of many tournaments that were famed and renowned, starting from the 15th century. In France, in Germany, in Burgundy especially, and in England. And they had each been known for one thing or another thing, and stories were told. And somehow in everybody's mind, the best ever was the Field of Cloth of Gold. That became the epitome of all tournaments and was recounted and told. And Edward Hall produced a chronicle in which he described everything in lavish, glorious detail, all the costumes, what the horses were, the feathers, the wine, every single detail. And people talked about it and recounted it for not just the few years that passed, but for decades that passed, for this next century that passed. An extraordinary thing is that it still holds sway today.
As the era of gunpowder took hold, the role of the armoured knight on the battlefield diminished, and so in turn did the tournament of arms. Now, hundreds of years later, the medieval knight, armed with sword or lance, remains a symbol of the far-flung times of the reign of chivalry.